Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we'll drift back further than written memory, further than the first word carved in stone or the first song hummed around a fire. We'll travel to a time so ancient that it sits at the blurry edge between myth and memory, where the first humans looked up at the stars and wondered not just what they were, but who had placed them there. It's a thought that might sound whimsical at first, but tonight let's explore it gently. What if humanity didn't start entirely on its own? What if, long before Egypt, before Sumer, before any empire we can name, there existed a civilization so old that its lessons became the foundation of everything that followed? A civilization that, in some quiet and forgotten way, taught early humans everything. Before we start unfolding that idea, take a breath and notice where you are right now. Maybe you're lying in bed, the lights dim, your phone screen glowing softly. Maybe the world around you has already quieted down for the night, or maybe it's still humming faintly through a city window. Wherever you are, you're part of a chain of moments that reaches back tens of thousands of years. Every thought you have, every word you know, every tool you touch, is part of a story that didn't begin with you or me, but with the first ones who looked at the unknown and decided to understand it. So, where are you listening from tonight? A small apartment? A distant time zone? A place with stars or streetlights outside your window? In this quiet space, imagine that you're joining a long line of listeners stretching all the way back to those early firesides, where stories were the first science and memory was the only library. If you find this slow dive into the oldest mysteries soothing or intriguing, a little like wandering through ancient ruins with your thoughts as your guide, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like, maybe even subscribed. It helps this calm corner of curiosity find others who might also need a peaceful place to wander before sleep. Now, let's take our first step together into the deep past. Not in haste, but slowly, as if crossing a threshold covered in dust, where the air itself remembers. Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient world, long before the word civilization meant cities, or kings, or calendars. The air is thick with the smell of earth and smoke, the ground is littered with bones, and somewhere nearby the first sparks of human consciousness are beginning to flicker. Our ancestors, the early Homo sapiens, have already learned to hunt, to make tools, to gather around the warmth of fire. But something is shifting in their minds. The drawings begin, hands on cave walls, shapes of animals, strange dots and patterns that some believe were not just art, but language, or even instruction. Those markings are the first whispers, the faintest record of an idea too complex to vanish entirely with time. Something, or someone, had begun to teach. It's easy to think of early humans as isolated tribes scattered across a wild earth, learning everything through slow trial and error. But what if some knowledge arrived faster than expected? Agriculture appeared in several parts of the world at roughly the same time. Monumental architecture, from the stone circles of Britain to the temple mounds of Turkey, emerged suddenly without a clear path of development. Even the stories our ancestors told, from the deserts of Africa to the islands of Polynesia, share echoes of the same cosmic teachers, beings from the sky, wise ancestors from the sea, gods who walked the earth and showed humans how to build, how to count, how to speak. Are these just coincidences of storytelling? Or are they the faded memories of a civilization so ancient that it now survives only in myth? If you were to trace the roots of knowledge, the kind that builds calendars, designs cities, and measures stars, you'd find that they often appear fully formed in the archaeological record. The Sumerians, for example, seem to appear out of nowhere around 6,000 years ago, with written language, advanced mathematics, and irrigation systems already in place. The Egyptians too, with their precise astronomical alignments, hieroglyphs, and complex architecture, seem to rise without a visible evolutionary staircase beneath them. Archaeologists explain these leaps as the result of long but undocumented development, and perhaps they're right. But what if those missing steps aren't missing? What if they're buried beneath more than soil? Buried beneath forgotten epochs of human history when the teacher still walked among us? There's a name that occasionally surfaces in conversations like this: the first civilization. Not Atlantis in its mythical ocean-swallowed form, but something real, tangible, yet lost. A society that may have existed before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower and vast regions of land now underwater were home to thriving communities. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth warmed, the ice melted, and oceans rose more than 100 meters, swallowing coastlines and perhaps entire cultures. If such a civilization existed, coastal, maritime, and wise, it would have disappeared almost entirely beneath the waves, leaving behind only scattered clues, like ancient ruins now submerged off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. But why would this matter? Because knowledge doesn't just vanish, it travels. It survives in stories, in rituals, in habits so ancient we no longer question where they came from. The alignment of early temples to the solstices, the counting systems embedded in myth, the shared memory of floods and teachers and builders, all might be echoes of that first great transmission of knowledge. If an earlier civilization had truly taught early humans everything, its lessons wouldn't have been written in books. They would have been written into our behaviour, our biology, even our curiosity itself. When you think about it, teaching is one of humanity's most instinctive acts. We do it without thinking. Parents teach children, elders teach youth, and across generations ideas refine and spread. Now imagine that this instinct wasn't ours alone, that it was inherited. Imagine the first humans being shown how to turn clay into bricks, how to track the stars to mark the seasons, how to carve stone so it stands for millennia. And imagine those teachers watching quietly as their students spread, adapt, and eventually forget who first guided them. There's something both haunting and comforting in that idea that all of civilization might be an echo of a lesson too old to name. Archaeologists often describe the birth of civilization as a spark that ignited spontaneously in several parts of the world. But perhaps it wasn't a spark. Perhaps it was a hand passed from one generation to the next, an inheritance that began in one forgotten place and spread through migration, story, and imitation. The ruins at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, for instance, are at least 11,000 years old, built by hunter-gatherers before the supposed invention of agriculture. The carvings are complex, symbolic, deliberate. It suggests a level of organisation, purpose, and shared knowledge that doesn't fit the standard model. It's as if someone already knew how to build, how to align, how to remember. If you could walk among those ancient builders, you'd find people who didn't yet know the word civilization, yet they carried the seed of it in their minds. They might not have had kings or currency, but they had geometry, astronomy, ritual. Where did those come from? To some, the answer lies in gradual evolution. To others, in instruction, lessons remembered dimly, preserved in symbols and passed along until the symbols themselves became sacred. The circle, the cross, the spiral. These shapes appear in nearly every ancient culture, long before they had any contact. It's almost as if they were inherited, like the alphabet of an ancient language we've long forgotten how to read. Think about that for a moment. How much of what you know today came from someone else? The way you tie a knot, hold a spoon, read a sentence, or look at a clock. None of it was discovered alone. We live surrounded by invisible inheritance. So perhaps it's not so strange to imagine that the first humans were also inheritors, not of wealth, but of wisdom, a kind of prehistoric mentorship that set them on a path toward everything that followed. Over thousands of years, the original meaning of those lessons would have blurred. The teachers became gods, the instructions became myths, and the knowledge became instinct. But somewhere, In that ancient exchange, humanity's curiosity found its shape. Every civilization since has told stories about its origins, often about gods or wise ancestors who descended from the sky or rose from the sea to teach humankind. The Dogon people of Mali speak of beings from the star Sirius, who brought knowledge of astronomy long before telescopes existed. The Sumerians told of the Anunnaki, beings who taught them agriculture, architecture, and law. In South America, the Inca spoke of Viracocha, a tall, bearded figure who came from the sea after a great flood and taught them how to rebuild. Across the Pacific, Polynesian myths tell of navigators from the stars. The pattern is eerily consistent. Teachers appear, civilization begins, and the teachers vanish. Whether you read those as metaphors or memories, the message is the same. Knowledge was given. Of course, science asks for evidence, and rightly so. Stories alone cannot prove the existence of a forgotten civilization. But when we look at the archaeological record, we see anomalies that don't fit neatly into the timeline. Tools and carvings found in layers older than expected, maps from the early Renaissance that show coastlines we couldn't have known before modern exploration. Megalithic structures that require engineering precision we still debate today. None of these, on their own, confirm the idea of ancient teachers, but together they paint a picture of humanity rediscovering something, as if climbing back toward a knowledge once lost. If this idea holds any truth, then the first civilization wasn't defined by cities or conquest, but by curiosity, by the desire to understand and to pass that understanding forward. Maybe they watched the stars not to worship them, but to measure them. Maybe they built monuments not as tombs, but as textbooks written in stone. And maybe their greatest achievement wasn't a structure or an invention, but the act of teaching itself, igniting a curiosity that still drives us today. When we study the ruins of our past, we often do so with a kind of quiet arrogance, assuming that progress is linear and that our ancestors were primitive compared to us. But what if intelligence isn't measured by technology, but by understanding? What if those ancient builders knew things we've only recently rediscovered, not through magic, but through careful observation and deep time? The tides, the stars, the seasons, the stones. Perhaps they read the earth like a book we've only just learned to open again. It's strange to think that every one of us is a product of memory, not just personal memory, but collective memory stretching back through uncounted generations. The shape of a tool, the rhythm of language, the instinct to look up at the stars, all of it inherited. So, when we speak of a first civilization that taught early humans everything, maybe we're not speaking of an empire or a people at all, but of the moment when memory became more powerful than instinct, when knowledge began to travel farther than the body, outliving the ones who first discovered it. If you listen closely, you can almost imagine those first teachers, not as mysterious strangers, but as reflections of ourselves at our most curious. They might not have built spaceships or written equations, but they understood the importance of sharing what they knew. And maybe that's what makes us their descendants. We still gather to learn. We still pass stories to those who come after. We still look at the world and ask, how does it work? Why are we here? What came before us? So as the night deepens and you begin to feel the gentle pull of sleep, hold on to that thought, that you are part of an unbroken chain of learning stretching back to the first spark of thought on this planet. Perhaps the first civilization didn't vanish at all. Perhaps it became us. It's easy to forget that for most of our existence we didn't have cities, calendars or clocks. The story of humanity is mostly a quiet one, written not in monuments but in the dust of paths we walked and the ashes of fires that went out long ago. Before there were civilizations to remember or historians to record them, there were simply people, families, wanderers, hunters, dreamers. They lived by the rhythm of light and dark, by hunger and rain, by the sound of animals in the distance and the shape of stars overhead. And somehow, in those simple, perilous lives, the foundation of everything we now call civilization began to form. Long before it had a name. If you could travel back to that world, you wouldn't find grand temples or stone towers. You'd find a landscape alive with movement. Herds crossing open plains, rivers shifting their paths, the scent of smoke from a small fire rising into cold morning air. Around that fire a few figures are gathered. They speak in soft sounds, gestures, glances. There's no grammar, no written words, but there's understanding. They point to the sky, to the fire, to each other. They're sharing something that's more than instinct. The first traces of deliberate teaching. Language is being born. It won't be written for tens of thousands of years, but already it's taking shape in the space between breaths. What those early humans didn't know, and perhaps couldn't have known, is that this small act, one mind reaching toward another to share a thought, would become the core of civilization. Teaching didn't begin in schools or temples. It began by the fire, in the simple act of showing someone how to strike a spark, how to shape a stone, how to tell which berries won't make you sick. From those moments of shared survival grew something extraordinary. Culture. Every word, every gesture, every lesson stored in memory rather than in books. Civilization wasn't a place at first. It was a pattern of remembering. When archaeologists look at the earliest human sites, they often find tools that seem far too refined for the time they belong to. Perfectly shaped blades, beads made from shells carried hundreds of kilometers inland, ochre used for painting long before the concept of art existed. These are clues that the people who made them weren't just surviving, they were thinking, imagining, planning. They had begun to build mental maps of their world. And where there are maps, there are stories. It's one thing to live in the world and another to describe it. The moment someone could describe it, even in gestures or grunts, something new began. The ability to imagine what isn't there. That's the true dawn of civilization. Not the first city, but the first idea that outlived its thinker. The first story passed down through generations. The first remembered instruction that made life easier for someone else. It might have been as simple as follow the herds this way when the moon is full, or these routes cure pain. But from those sentences came the logic of calendars, medicine, and navigation. Before the pyramids or the temples, there was memory, and memory was enough to change everything. It's strange to think that for almost 95% of our history, humans lived without writing. All the great libraries of the ancient world, all the inventions and philosophies, occupy only a tiny fraction of our timeline. The rest is a blur of unrecorded experience, a vast silent film of humanity learning, forgetting, and learning again. And yet, that silence wasn't empty. It was filled with voices, laughter, song, and stories told under the stars. Those stories might sound like myths now, but to the people who told them, they were instruction manuals for survival. Which plants bloom when the rains come? Which stars mark the changing seasons? Where to find shelter? Where danger sleeps? Somewhere in that deep prehistory, groups began to gather in larger numbers. The ice was retreating, the planet was warming, and food became more abundant. For the first time, people could stay in one place long enough to notice patterns. They watched how shadows changed through the year, how rivers flooded and receded, how animals migrated. Slowly, the rhythms of nature became the rhythms of thought. Time wasn't just something that passed anymore. It was something that could be measured, predicted, and even shaped. The first calendars weren't carved in stone. They were the patterns of stars remembered by storytellers, sung to children, and passed along like sacred knowledge. Civilization began not with kings, but with those who remembered. If you imagine these early communities, they might not look like the civilizations we picture today. There are no written laws or temples, but there are shared customs, roles, and rituals. There's the hunter who knows where the herds move, the gatherer who recognizes the smell of safe plants, the elder who remembers which cave floods in spring, and the one who can tell stories so vivid they keep fear away at night. Every one of them holds a part of something larger than themselves. Knowledge isn't owned, it's lived. And when one person dies, the knowledge is passed to another. That's civilization before writing. A living library that breathes and ages like the people who carry it. You can almost see how this would feel. Sitting around the fire, hearing someone describe the stars, realizing that the same patterns will appear again next year. The comfort in knowing that what has happened will happen again, and that you can prepare for it. That's the moment the future was invented. The shift from reacting to predicting, from surviving to planning. It must have felt miraculous, the idea that the world followed a rhythm, and that humans could learn to dance to it. When archaeologists discovered sites like Blombus Cave in South Africa, with carved pieces of ochre dating back more than 70,000 years, they realised that symbolic thought appeared far earlier than we used to believe. Those markings weren't random. They were deliberate, symmetrical, possibly part of a code or a ritual. It suggests that even then, humans weren't just reacting to the world, they were representing it. And representation is the root of all culture. Once you can symbolise something, you can share it, you can teach it, and once you can teach it, you can build on it. Knowledge compounds like interest. Every generation inherits not just what the last discovered, but what the last understood. At some point, small groups became larger ones. Villages formed. People began to share not just food, but ideas, beliefs, and dreams. The first artists painted animals they might never have hunted, scenes that might never have happened. Perhaps those paintings were stories, or prayers, or simply experiments in imagination. Whatever their purpose, they show us that humans had begun to create worlds within their minds. To imagine something that didn't exist and make it visible. That's the seed of invention, of architecture, of myth. All the tools of civilization sprout from that same root. Imagination made real. But there's something else here too. Cooperation. Civilization requires it. You can't build even a small structure alone, or plant a field without help. Before we learned to work stone, we learned to work together. And to do that, we had to trust, communicate, and remember who had done what. In a sense, the first governments weren't monarchies or councils, but communities bound by shared responsibility. The tribe that remembered which way the herds moved was stronger than the one that forgot. The group that shared knowledge survived longer than the one that kept it secret. Slowly, the act of sharing became sacred. Teaching became ritual. Memory became inheritance. There's an interesting pattern that emerges in archaeological layers. Wherever humans settled for long periods, we find evidence of ceremony. Graves with offerings. Carvings that seem to represent ancestors or spirits. It suggests that memory wasn't just practical, it became emotional, even spiritual. People began to revere those who came before them, to honour their lessons, and in doing so they created continuity. The living and the dead were part of the same story, the same chain of knowledge stretching backward into mystery. That reverence is what later became religion, but before it was theology, it was gratitude. Gratitude for those who taught, for those who remembered, for those who helped life continue. It's possible that this reverence for memory gave rise to the earliest myths about divine teachers, not because gods descended from the sky, but because the first humans saw teaching itself as sacred. Imagine someone in a small nomadic group who could explain why the moon changed shape or how to predict rain by reading clouds. That person would seem almost supernatural. They would become a keeper of knowledge, a bridge between the known and the unknown. Over time, as stories passed from one generation to the next, the line between teacher and God blurred. The idea of the first civilization, the first great teachers, might have begun right there, in awe of the human mind's ability to understand. You can almost picture the moment when someone first carved a symbol, not just for beauty but for meaning. Maybe they drew a circle to represent the sun, or a line of dots for days past. Those markings were memory externalized. For the first time, knowledge didn't have to rely solely on words or remembrance. It could be preserved physically outside the mind. That was the first step toward writing, the first whisper of permanence. Civilization had begun to leave footprints deeper than bone. When we look back now, it's tempting to see this evolution as inevitable. But nothing about it was guaranteed. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived without agriculture, without cities, without writing. Then, in what seems like an instant on the geological timeline, everything changed. We began to settle, to farm, to build. It's as if something clicked. Maybe it was population pressure, maybe climate change, or maybe it was the cumulative weight of all those quiet lessons passed down by firelight finally tipping the balance. A critical mass of memory reached, and suddenly the world could no longer remain the same. What's remarkable is that even the earliest known civilizations, when they did appear, seemed to arrive already knowing certain things: geometry, astronomy, even basic medicine. There's little evidence of experimentation or gradual development in those early stages. It's as though the knowledge had been carried through the ages, preserved in oral tradition long before it was written. The first civilization then might not have been a single place or people, but an era, a time when humanity, scattered across continents, shared a growing sense of awareness, a collective awakening passed hand to hand. Every generation adds its layer to the story. Maybe the ones before us added theirs in song or carving rather than ink, but the effect is the same. We inherit the world as they understood it, build upon it, and pass it forward. Civilization before names and borders was like an unbroken melody, changing with each voice that sang it, but never ceasing. Even now, we can still hear faint echoes of it in the oldest myths, in rituals whose meanings we've forgotten, but whose forms we still follow. Lighting candles, watching the sky, marking the passage of days. These are remnants of an ancient rhythm older than history itself. It's worth pausing to imagine how it must have felt to live then, in a world without history, where every discovery felt like the first, and every day was a lesson. To look at the horizon and not yet have a word for distance, to see lightning and not yet know the word for power, to watch birth and death without the vocabulary to separate them into ideas. That world wasn't primitive, it was pure, it was the beginning of thought trying to understand itself. Civilization in that sense didn't start when we built walls, it started when we began to ask questions, and even now, after millennia of progress, we still ask the same ones. Where did we come from? Who taught us? How did we learn to be what we are? The answers may be buried beneath ice or ocean, or perhaps they're hidden in our own behaviour, in the way we pass knowledge to each other instinctively, endlessly. Before civilization had a name, it was already alive in us, waiting to be remembered. The night is long, but history is longer, and as the mind drifts through these thoughts, the line between past and present begins to blur. The people who painted on cave walls, who watched the first sunrise of a new season, who looked at the stars and wondered what they meant, they're not gone. They're here, in every word, every idea, every small act of understanding that keeps the world illuminated. Somewhere in that continuity we're still sitting by the fire, still learning, still remembering what the first teachers once tried to show us. And as the flames fade to embers, the story continues, toward the ones who might have lit those first fires of knowledge themselves, the ones we still call the forgotten architects of wisdom. It's strange how silence can hold so much memory. We often think that to remember something it must be recorded, written or spoken. But sometimes the past lingers in shapes, in alignments, in the quiet precision of things built to last longer than names. The forgotten architects of knowledge didn't leave behind diaries or manifestos. They left stone. They left symmetry. They left mysteries that still make the most rational among us pause, tilt their heads, and wonder, how, by the time we can trace recognizable civilization on the surface of the earth, with writing, rulers and recorded laws, it already looks like a continuation, not a beginning. The Sumerians were measuring the heavens with mathematics so precise that we still use echoes of it in our systems of time. The Egyptians were aligning temples and pyramids with celestial accuracy that modern instruments can barely improve upon. The builders of Stonehenge knew how to track solstices and eclipses with circles of rock that defy their age. None of these achievements appear in isolation. They arrive as though someone had already done the groundwork, as though the instructions had been whispered from a place long buried or long sunk beneath the sea. Imagine standing at one of those ancient sites, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, the pyramids, Machu Picchu. Feel the stones beneath your fingertips. You're touching something that human hands shaped thousands of years ago, with tools that shouldn't have been able to achieve such perfection, under conditions that seem impossibly challenging. The blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon weigh hundreds of tons each. The joints between stones at Sacsayhuaman in Peru are so precise that you couldn't slide a sheet of paper between them. These feats don't just show strength, they show knowledge, geometry, leverage, planning. They show memory. Someone knew things that the people who came after would have to rediscover slowly, painfully over centuries. We call those builders ancient, but perhaps ancient isn't the right word. Maybe they were the inheritors of something even older, something passed through catastrophe and forgetting. When the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose more than 100 metres. Entire regions vanished beneath the ocean. Sunderland near Indonesia, Doggerland between Britain and Europe, large stretches of the Indian and Pacific coastlines. If people lived there, if they built, if they learned to organise, trade or study the sky, their cities are now silent reefs, their stories buried beneath silt, and yet fragments remain. Off the coast of India, divers have found submerged structures resembling streets and walls. In Japan's Yonaguni, terraces carved into underwater rock look suspiciously deliberate. No one can say for sure what they were. Perhaps natural formations, perhaps ruins. But the mind can't help but wonder what it would mean if they weren't. Because if an advanced civilization existed before history, before the world we recognise as civilized began, it would have been erased almost completely by the flood of time. Only the highest monuments might have survived, the ones built on ground too stubborn or sacred to drown. Those might be the first seeds from which later civilizations grew. Imagine the survivors of that lost world carrying fragments of their knowledge inland, star maps, agricultural techniques, a sense of proportion and measure, and teaching them to others. Over generations, the origins of that knowledge would blur. The teachers would become myths, their homes transformed into heavens, their ships into chariots of the gods. This isn't the fantasy of a bedtime story, though it has that quiet wonder about it. Even respected archaeologists and geologists acknowledge that traces of human habitation far older than expected occasionally appear, though rarely enough to rewrite textbooks. A shaped tool here, a fire pit there, a fragment of pottery in the wrong sedimentary layer. Each discovery sparks debate. Was it contamination, coincidence, or a clue to something larger? The more we find, the more the old neat timeline of progress begins to look like a mosaic. Pieces missing, colours fading, edges that don't quite fit but still belong to the same picture. If you step back and look at that mosaic, a pattern begins to emerge. Across continents, the oldest known monuments share certain traits. They're massive, precisely aligned to celestial events, and built in ways that seem designed not just to last, but to teach. At Göbekli Tepe, the stone pillars are arranged with careful astronomical significance, tracking stars and seasons. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid's sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. At Chichen Itza, the shadow of the serpent god slithers down the temple steps only on the equinoxes. These aren't coincidences. They're lessons written in architecture, cosmic textbooks preserved in stone. But what kind of teachers would build on such a scale? Perhaps they weren't individuals, but cultures themselves, societies devoted not just to survival, but to understanding. We often imagine ancient people as preoccupied only with food, shelter, and safety. Yet time and again, they invested staggering effort into observing the sky, marking cycles, aligning temples. These weren't idle curiosities, they were deliberate acts of remembrance. To watch the heavens is to measure time, to predict seasons, to understand change, and to record that understanding in stone is to pass it forward, to say to the distant future, "We knew this once, remember it." There's something humbling about that message. Knowledge, when it's new, feels like discovery. But knowledge that returns, that re-emerges after millennia, feels like memory. The forgotten architects of knowledge might not have been gods or aliens, as some legends suggest, but humans whose minds were no less capable than ours, whose curiosity was sharpened by survival, whose hands were steady and sure. They didn't need computers to calculate, only patience. They didn't need cranes to lift, only understanding of weight and balance that modern engineers still admire. Consider the stones of Pumapunku in Bolivia, carved with interlocking precision. Some have perfectly straight grooves, right angles, and drilled holes that look as though they were made with machinery. Yet they were shaped over 1,000 years ago, perhaps with simple copper tools. How? No one knows for certain. The explanations range from lost techniques to the persistence of an oral engineering tradition older than history itself. Maybe it was both. The method may have been ancient, but the mind that used it was entirely human, creative, determined, endlessly curious. It's tempting to romanticize these mysteries, to imagine hidden powers or lost technologies. But maybe the truth is even more extraordinary in its simplicity. What if the forgotten architects weren't magicians or deities, but teachers? The kind of teachers who understood that the greatest gift isn't invention, but transmission. To pass an idea so clearly that it outlives its creator, to build something so enduring that it continues to instruct even when the words are gone. Each temple, each stone circle, each alignment may have been a classroom in disguise, an open-air library built not for gods but for students who hadn't been born yet. Every culture that followed seems to echo that same reverence for building as teaching. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the step pyramids of Mesoamerica, the mounds of North America, the dolmens scattered across Europe, they all speak of a shared impulse to mark, to preserve, to teach. They remind us that civilization isn't defined by comfort, but by continuity. It's a chain of understanding stretching backward through time, and at its beginning stand those we no longer remember by name. Sometimes the clues left by these architects are subtle, not monuments, but measurements. In ancient sites across the world, the same ratios appear: geometric constants, angles, proportions. The golden ratio, the circle divided by pi, the sacred geometry that reappears again and again as if woven into the human psyche. We think of mathematics as invention, but perhaps it's discovery, the rediscovery of something our ancestors once knew intimately. Maybe they didn't need equations. Maybe they saw these proportions in nature, in shells, in plants, in the curvature of the horizon, and recognized in them a universal rhythm. When they built in harmony with that rhythm, and so their works endure. The architects we've forgotten didn't just shape stone, they shaped perception. By fixing knowledge into the world around them, they made it visible, physical. When you look at an ancient structure and feel a strange calm, a sense of proportion that feels almost musical, you're feeling the echo of their minds. The language of balance they spoke is still legible, even across the gulf of millennia. That's the brilliance of teaching through form rather than words. Words fade, stone endures, but even stone isn't immune to time. Earthquakes shift it, wind erodes it, rain smooths it away. What remains is fragmentary, enigmatic, incomplete. So we look at what's left and try to reconstruct the story. Each generation builds its own interpretation, layering modern imagination over ancient purpose. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we project our own dreams onto the past. But either way, the connection persists. We're still learning from those early architects, even if the lesson now is humility. A reminder that knowledge isn't a ladder climbing upward forever, but a circle. We rediscover what was once known, we add our own insights, and then we pass them on, hoping someone in the distant future will understand. It's possible that those early builders never meant to be remembered personally. Perhaps they built not for glory, but for continuity, to ensure that when the world changed, when floods came, when empires fell, when languages vanished, the essentials of understanding would survive. How to measure the year, how to align with the stars, how to find balance, both literal and cosmic. Their monuments may have been textbooks disguised as temples, survival guides carved in metaphor. And if that's true, then they succeeded. Because here we are, thousands of years later, still reading their work, still puzzling over their meaning, still inspired to ask the same questions they once must have asked. Where do we come from? How does the world work? What happens when we forget? Those questions are the foundation of all science, all philosophy, all faith. The architects didn't just give us structures, they gave us a way to think. When you walk through a museum or see photographs of ancient ruins, it's easy to feel a kind of awe that borders on disbelief. How could people so long ago have been so precise, so visionary? But maybe that disbelief says more about us than about them. We've grown used to measuring intelligence by technology, to equating progress with novelty. Yet the mind that imagined the first temple, that plotted the motion of the stars with nothing but sight and patience, was every bit as capable as ours, perhaps more so, because it had to be. Without machines, they relied on understanding. Without books, they relied on memory. Without the distractions of modern noise, they listened to the world more closely. The forgotten architects weren't bound by our definitions of civilization. They didn't separate science from spirituality or art from engineering. To them, building a temple was as much about harmony as structure. The same stone that framed the stars might also frame belief. The same calculation that predicted the solstice might also define ritual. In their world, knowledge wasn't specialized. It was whole. That wholeness is what allowed them to build in ways we still struggle to explain. It's comforting to think that somewhere within us, we carry fragments of that same unity. When we marvel at symmetry, when we trace the path of the sun across the sky, when we feel the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem or finishing a creation, we're echoing them. The first teachers, the first builders, the forgotten architects of knowledge. We might have lost their names, but not their influence. It's in our hands, our eyes, our instincts. If we could speak to them, if somehow across the abyss of time a conversation could happen, what would they say? Perhaps nothing more than, remember what we remembered. Perhaps they would tell us that every generation must rebuild, relearn, reinterpret. That forgetting is part of learning. That loss is part of continuity. The knowledge that survives isn't the kind that resists change, but the kind that adapts to it. As the stars wheel overhead and the night deepens, the thought lingers that we are still their students. We stand on the same earth, beneath the same constellations they once studied. We use the same mathematics they glimpsed in the world's design. We still search for meaning in the patterns of sky and stone. The forgotten architects may have vanished, but their lesson endures, that the universe can be understood, that knowledge can be shared, and that the act of teaching, even across thousands of years, is a kind of immortality. And somewhere, far beneath the ocean's waves or buried under layers of soil, the remnants of their world may still rest, waiting patiently for us to rediscover them, waiting for another generation of listeners to hear the echoes and recognize them not as myths, but as messages from those who came before. The fire burns low again in the mind's eye, its glow soft against the dark. The shapes of the ancient stones seem to flicker like memories themselves, half seen, half felt, and as the silence settles once more, the story continues, onward into the echoes they left in the heavens, where stone and sky meet, and the next memory begins to unfold. When we look up at the night sky, we see light that has travelled for thousands of years to reach us. Every star is an echo, a message from the deep past still arriving long after its sender has vanished. The same can be said for the oldest stones of Earth. They too speak across time, not with words, but with alignment, placement, and patience. In both the sky and the stone, something ancient waits for anyone quiet enough to listen. The forgotten architects left their fingerprints everywhere, but the most enduring are written in two materials that never forget: rock and starlight. Across continents and oceans, the earliest builders lifted immense stones into deliberate patterns. Circles, corridors, pyramids, mounds. Each one seems to hum with purpose. Some point to the sunrise, some to the moon's cycles, others to stars that have since shifted in the heavens. It's as if, across the whole Earth, people were taught to use the same celestial textbook. Whether in Egypt, Britain, China, or Mesoamerica, the sky was their teacher and the stones were their notebooks. At first glance, these alignments seem almost too perfect to be coincidence. The Great Pyramid sides match the cardinal directions with astonishing precision. Stonehenge frames the midsummer sunrise. The temples of Angkor in Cambodia mirror the constellation Draco. The pyramids of Teotihuacan line up with the stars of Orion's belt. Half a world apart, separated by oceans and millennia, the same silent conversation between earth and sky seems to play out again and again. The modern mind, comfortable with digital clocks and electric calendars, often wonders why they cared so much. Why move millions of pounds of stone to mark the position of the sun on one day of the year? Why carve celestial maps into caves or build observatories from boulders? The answer may be simpler and deeper than we expect. To those early civilizations, the sky wasn't just a backdrop. It was a guide, a clock, a mirror, and perhaps a memory of the teachers who first taught them to look up. Imagine a time when there were no artificial lights, no city haze, no barriers between people and the night. The stars would have been overwhelming, countless, clear, infinite. To study them was to find order in chaos. The slow dance of the planets, the steady return of certain constellations, the rare flash of a comet. These patterns would have felt like messages from the universe itself. But what if, for some, they weren't just natural rhythms to be admired? What if they were reminders of a teaching once given, a way of marking time and place that linked heaven and earth in one continuous design? Consider how knowledge often hides inside ritual. The people who built Stonehenge didn't just raise stones, they gathered there to observe, to mark moments, to remember. It might have been celebration, it might have been worship, but beneath the ceremony was a scientific core. They had calculated the tilt of the earth, the movement of the sun, the rhythm of the seasons. In those measurements lay survival, when to plant, when to harvest, when the herds would move. But perhaps there was also nostalgia, a sense of carrying on a tradition older than their language, a tradition taught by the first to watch the stars with intention. In the deserts of Egypt, that same impulse became monumental. The builders of the pyramids oriented them not just to the compass, but to the stars. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point directly to the ancient positions of Orion and Sirius, two of the brightest and most mythically charged stars in human memory. The Egyptians believed their gods came from those constellations, but perhaps the story began as something more practical, a way of aligning their calendar to celestial cycles. Over time, as memory faded, the teachers and the stars became gods, and the instructions became worship. It's easy to see how knowledge turns into myth when time passes long enough. The facts remain, but their meanings drift, reshaped by story and faith. The same pattern appears far from the Nile. In Mesoamerica, the Maya built cities that functioned as vast observatories. The temple at Chichen Itza casts a serpent-shaped shadow on the equinox, a perfect interplay of light and architecture that could only come from careful astronomical study. To achieve that, they had to know not only the movement of the sun but the tilt of the earth and the geometry of the horizon. And they weren't alone. The builders of Teotihuacan centuries earlier had aligned their city's main avenue with the setting of the Pleiades, a cluster of stars linked to agricultural timing. Once again, knowledge wrapped itself in story, and science became ritual. All over the world, this same pattern repeats. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, a stone circle predating Stonehenge by thousands of years marks the rising of the summer solstice sun. In the ruins of Machu Picchu, windows line up perfectly with the solstices, while nearby at the Intihuatana stone, often called the hitching post of the sun, shadows disappear entirely at midday during the equinox, suggesting the builders were tracking solar zeniths with precision. Even in far northern Europe, at sites like Newgrange in Ireland, the dawn sunlight on the winter solstice shines deep into the inner chamber, illuminating carvings of spirals and circles that may represent celestial cycles. How could so many different peoples, separated by oceans and ages, all have built the same kind of monuments for the same kind of purpose? Coincidence is possible, but the pattern feels almost too coordinated. Some researchers propose that knowledge travelled, that long before our recorded civilizations, seafarers or nomadic teachers carried ideas across the world, leaving behind not just tools or genes, but a shared understanding of the cosmos. Others argue that any intelligent people observing the same sky would naturally come to similar conclusions. Both may be true, but it's hard not to feel that faint echo of instruction, that whisper of something older echoing through their work. The stones don't just mark time, they also carry emotion. The act of lifting them, carving them, aligning them, it wasn't only about observation, it was about belonging. To look at the heavens and see meaning is to feel part of something larger, to sense that the world is connected. The builders might have felt that they were not only recording the stars, but recreating their patterns on Earth, as if to make the planet itself a reflection of the sky. Temples became mirrors, cities became constellations. The phrase, "as above, so below," which appears in texts thousands of years later, might have begun as an intuitive truth among the first astronomers and builders, a recognition that the same order governs both stone and star. This idea that human structures should mirror celestial ones appears in cultures that never met. The Chinese built their ancient capitals according to the pole star's position. The Egyptians placed their pyramids to reflect Orion's belt. The Inca aligned their sacred sites with the Milky Way's curves. Even the mound builders of North America shaped their earthworks to track lunar cycles and solstices. It's as though humanity, wherever it awoke to awareness, instinctively tried to write the sky upon the land, to make knowledge visible, permanent, and grounded. It's worth remembering how much patience this required. Without telescopes, without clocks, without metal tools, they watched and measured with nothing but eyes and persistence. A complete lunar cycle takes nearly 19 years to repeat. Some alignments, like those tracking Venus or the precession of the equinoxes, span centuries. That means someone had to start an observation knowing they'd never see it finished, trusting the next generation to continue. That's not just science, that's faith, not in gods, but in learning itself. And that, perhaps, is the true meaning of those echoes in stone and sky. They are not messages from another world, but from another time. A message that says, keep watching, keep measuring, keep passing this on. Every alignment is a conversation across ages, between the builders and those who would someday rediscover their work. When modern astronomers calculate the exact dates those monuments tracked, when we use satellites to confirm their alignments, we're answering a question that was asked thousands of years ago. Sometimes the echoes are even more literal. The acoustic properties of ancient sites often seem intentionally designed. The temples of Chavin in Peru carry sound through their corridors in ways that amplify and echo like instruments. The Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza reflects sound waves so precisely that a clap at one end produces multiple echoes like bird calls. Even Stonehenge, when reconstructed digitally, creates resonance patterns that could carry voices over long distances. To the people who built them, sound, like light, was another kind of connection between earth and sky. Vibration as language, resonance as remembrance. It's easy to see why later generations interpreted all this as divine. When you stand inside such a place and feel the air hum with alignment, when the first beam of sunlight pierces the chamber on the solstice, or the stars line up perfectly with carved markers, it feels like the universe itself is speaking. The rational mind today calls it astronomy, engineering, geometry, but the human heart even now calls it wonder. And perhaps that's exactly what the first teachers wanted us to feel. Not obedience, but awe. A curiosity so deep it keeps us looking up forever. Over the centuries, as languages shifted and empires rose and fell, the memory of why those structures were built began to fade. The builders' names were lost, their measurements turned into myths, their symbols into religion. A solar calendar became a tale of sun gods. An astronomical chart became a myth of serpents and dragons in the sky. Knowledge transformed into story because story is how the human mind remembers best. The science survived, disguised as legend. That's how knowledge hides, not by vanishing, but by changing shape. In that sense, the stones are not relics, they're participants. They continue the conversation quietly, century after century. Every time someone looks at them and wonders, they fulfill their purpose again. The echo travels forward, touching new minds. That's the beauty of ancient knowledge. It doesn't demand faith, only curiosity. You don't have to believe in it. You only have to notice it. Sometimes the sky returns the favour. The stars those ancient builders tracked have moved slightly over the millennia, shifting with the slow wobble of Earth's axis. When we compare their alignments to the stars as they are now, we can calculate exactly when those monuments were built. It's as if the sky itself is keeping their memory, preserving timestamps written in light. The teachers may have been forgotten, but their calendar still ticks on above us. Perhaps that's the true legacy of the first civilization. Not technology or wealth, but the habit of watching, the art of noticing. The same curiosity that drove them to carve stone and measure shadows still drives us to build telescopes and send probes into space. We still use the sky to orient ourselves, though now the stars we measure are light years away rather than seasons apart. Our questions haven't changed much. Only our instruments have. If the first teachers could see what we've built, satellites tracing orbits, telescopes reading the birth of galaxies, they might recognize the pattern immediately. Not because we've surpassed them, but because we've continued their work. The stones they lifted were our first observatories. The stories they told became our first equations. The echo they sent into the future has reached us, and in answering it, we send our own echo forward into the centuries to come. It's humbling to think that every human generation stands under the same sky, sees the same constellations, feels the same pull to understand. The patterns shift slowly, but the longing to decode them never does. Maybe that's why the stones were built, to remind us that knowledge is not a possession, but a path. The stars rise and set, the shadows move, the lessons remain. And somewhere in the stillness of night, when the last light fades and the first stars emerge, you can almost feel the connection, the pulse of continuity between mind and matter, between stone and sky, between us and those who came long before. They may be forgotten by name, but their language surrounds us still, written in the rhythm of the heavens and the enduring patience of the earth. The echo lingers, soft and steady, leading onward, toward the patterns above that once guided every traveller, every builder, every dreamer who ever looked up and began to understand. And through those patterns, the story carries forward into the next unfolding of wonder, where the language of the stars begins to speak once more. When night falls, far from the noise of cities, the sky feels impossibly vast. There's a quiet moment before your eyes adjust, and then, almost suddenly, the darkness fills with detail. Pinpoints of light scattered in every direction, some steady, some flickering, some faint and distant like forgotten memories. You can almost feel why our ancestors thought of the heavens as a language, a slow, patient one, written not in words, but in cycles, movements, and constellations that repeat across centuries. Long before alphabets, before paper or carving tools, the stars were the first text humanity ever learned to read. To those who came before civilization had a name, the sky wasn't decoration, it was instruction. The stars marked direction, guided migration, measured time, and even served a story. The night sky was the original classroom, and each constellation a lesson. What we call myth now was once method, a memory system for navigation, agriculture and survival. When people pointed to Orion or the Pleiades or the Southern Cross, they weren't just naming shapes, they were recalling patterns, marking seasons, predicting weather, and retelling histories that couldn't yet be written. Across every culture we know, the sky was both a map and a mirror. It reflected not just geography, but belief. The same patterns of stars were given different names in different tongues, but often with the same purpose: to teach, to remember, to connect. In the Northern Hemisphere, the Pleiades marked planting time for farmers in Greece, sowing season for the Maori, and navigation cues for sailors in the Pacific. The same cluster, seen by eyes worlds apart, carried the same message. Now is the moment to act. Now is the time to begin again. The stars spoke in timing, not in speech, and those who listened carefully enough survived. What's remarkable is how similar this stellar literacy was across early societies. No matter where you look, from the nomads of Arabia to the astronomer priests of Mesoamerica, the process was the same. Watch, record, predict, repeat. To study the heavens was to master cycles, to know when rain would come, when rivers would flood, when prey would migrate. But somewhere within that careful watching, curiosity began to shift. The patterns became more than practical. They became sacred. The stars weren't just tools, they were teachers. Each movement meant something, each return a reminder of an earlier lesson. The oldest observatories on Earth weren't built of glass or metal. They were open plains, clear horizons, rings of stones marking rising points on the horizon. At Nabta Playa, deep in the Sahara, a stone circle over 7,000 years old still marks the midsummer sunrise. Its builders were herders, not kings, yet their alignment shows a grasp of solar geometry that would later shape the great civilizations of the Nile. That kind of precision doesn't come from chance. It comes from generations of careful, continuous attention, a kind of observational patience almost unimaginable today. You can imagine how it began: a family, a tribe, a small group sitting near a fire, noticing how certain stars rose earlier as seasons changed. Someone began to keep count, perhaps with stones, perhaps with marks on a bone. Over years, the pattern became prediction. When this star appears, the rains will follow. Over generations, that pattern became teaching. When you see that star, plant your seeds, and eventually it became story. When that star rises, the god of water returns. By the time writing appeared, the teaching was already myth, but the truth remained inside it, layered like sediment, practical knowledge wrapped in narrative, preserved by repetition. To call this a language isn't poetic, it's literal. The stars became a syntax of survival, and the night sky was the blackboard on which it was written. Each culture developed its own grammar. The Egyptians used the heliacal rising of Sirius to predict the flooding of the Nile. The Babylonians tracked the planet's slow journeys, and discovered the patterns that would form the basis of astrology and early astronomy. In China, the imperial astronomers kept meticulous records of comets and eclipses, treating them as cosmic warnings, but their charts were mathematically rigorous. The Maya recorded Venus's cycle with such accuracy that their calendar remained unmatched for centuries. Everywhere, the act of reading the sky meant understanding the rhythm of the Earth. And somewhere, long before these systems were formalized, someone must have taught the first way to look up. That's the thought that lingers quietly behind this entire history. How did so many different peoples begin their learning in almost the same way, aligning with solstices, tracking lunar cycles, dividing the year by stars? It's tempting to believe they all discovered it independently, but there's a deeper possibility, one that hums like a faint signal through every culture. What if the way we look at the stars was itself inherited, passed down from those who came before, the first teachers who saw the sky as a message system and left that habit written into us? When you watch the sky today, the same movements play out that guided those first learners. The Earth spins, the stars appear to drift, the constellations tilt and return. Each night, a repetition, each year, a familiar wheel. The ancients saw in that repetition a kind of reassurance, proof that the universe had order, that chaos was an illusion of perspective. The stars rose and fell with precision, and within that precision was comfort. If you could predict the sky, perhaps you could predict life itself. That might be why early temples doubled as observatories. To align stone with the heavens was to align human existence with cosmic order. Even now, scientists find remnants of this cosmic symmetry hidden in ancient sites. The layout of Teotihuacan corresponds to the 260-day ritual calendar of Mesoamerica. The temples at Angkor align with the precession of the equinoxes. The megaliths at Callanish in Scotland track lunar standstills that occur only every 18.6 years. These are not coincidences born of superstition. They are calculations disguised as devotion, mathematics embedded in architecture. The builders knew exactly what they were doing. They were writing with stone in a language of shadow and light, encoding astronomical truth into their monuments. What's fascinating is how the stars became both tool and metaphor. Once humans began to see patterns in the sky, they started to see them everywhere. In rivers, in mountain ranges, in the paths of animals. The heavens became a reference for structure itself. As above, so below, said the Hermetic philosophers thousands of years later, but the idea was ancient. The order of the cosmos became the model for the order of human life. The first cities were planned like constellations. The first laws reflected celestial cycles. Even the earliest mythologies mirror cosmic events. Gods dying and returning like the sun, wars among the stars echoing storms on earth. The sky was both scripture and science, and the two are never separate. When we study the ancient world through modern eyes, it's easy to divide knowledge into categories: astronomy, religion, mathematics, art. But for those early observers, it was all one discipline. To study the sky was to understand existence itself. Every eclipse, every solstice, every conjunction was part of a larger pattern, and humans were woven into it. That's why ancient astronomers were also priests, storytellers, and engineers. They weren't just describing the stars, they were translating them. The cosmos wasn't distant, it was personal, instructive, intimate. Some modern researchers have suggested that this universal fascination with the sky might have deeper roots, even biological ones. The human brain is wired to detect patterns. We can't help it. It's how we survived. Recognizing order in the stars might have been the earliest form of scientific thinking, but also an expression of something emotional, the longing to find meaning in the infinite. The first time someone realized that the stars moved predictably, they must have felt awe, but also belonging. It meant the universe wasn't random. It could be known, understood, trusted. That trust may have been what allowed early humans to make the leap from survival to civilization. The stars gave them confidence in continuity, proof that tomorrow would come, that seasons would return, that knowledge could last beyond a single life. When you can predict the future in even the smallest way, you begin to plan. And planning is the foundation of civilization. Every field planted, every city designed, every temple raised began with a glance upward, with someone tracing a path through the stars and realizing it would come back again. There's something gentle in that idea, that our greatest achievements were born not from conquest, but from quiet observation. That civilization's roots are in watching, listening, and waiting. The sky asked for patience, and humanity answered with persistence. Even today, with telescopes that see galaxies billions of light years away, the process hasn't changed much. We still wait for the light to arrive. We still translate what we see into meaning. The difference is scale, not spirit. If the first civilization truly taught early humans everything, perhaps this was their first and most enduring lesson. To look up, to notice patterns, to trust the rhythm of the heavens. That simple act of watching, of connecting sky and season, became the first universal language, the one that required no translation. The stars spoke the same way to everyone. Whether in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, the lessons were identical because the teacher was the same, the cosmos itself. Even now, after all the technological advances, the same constellations guide ships, planes, and satellites. Our calendars still depend on the sun cycle. Our timekeeping still follows the motions of stars. We name our missions and our machines after the same lights our ancestors worshipped. In a way, the dialogue never stopped. The sky still speaks, and we, in our own modern dialect, still answer. It's worth pausing to imagine the feeling of that connection in its earliest form. Standing in an open field at night, no light but the fire and the stars, hearing nothing but wind. The constellations above are not abstractions, they are companions. They rise when food returns, when journeys begin, when children are born. Each star is a marker in a living calendar, and to forget it would be to forget how to live. The people who learned this language passed it down like a song, simple and memorable, so it could survive the long silence between generations. Even when the first cities appeared and people no longer roamed the open plains, they carried that song with them. They painted the sky on their ceilings, carved it into stone, aligned their streets with it. The sky became architecture, frozen in place. And though the meanings changed, the structure endured. To this day, our monuments, domes, towers, observatories are echoes of those first lessons. The habit of looking up never left us. It's built into our design. Some scholars suggest that the human fascination with symmetry, proportion, and harmony, the qualities we associate with beauty, might originate from this ancient relationship with the stars. The cosmos moves in balance, and we've spent our history trying to recreate that balance in everything we make. From music to mathematics, from art to engineering, we are still translating starlight into form. The first language never stopped speaking, it simply changed dialects. When you think about it that way, every act of curiosity becomes a kind of remembering. Every equation, every compass, every telescope is a continuation of a conversation that began when someone first pointed upward and said, "There." The first civilization may be gone, their teachers long silent, but the language they taught still fills the night. It's written above us, constant and calm, waiting to be read again. The stars don't shout, they don't demand, they simply are, endlessly repeating their patterns, indifferent to whether anyone is watching. Yet humanity has always watched. We've built entire philosophies on their stillness, entire mythologies on their motion. We've measured our lives against their cycles, trusted their return, and found meaning in their silence. In that quiet attention lies the essence of everything we call progress. Somewhere, deep in the background of the universe, their light continues to arrive. Old, patient, unchanged. And as long as there are eyes to look up and wonder, the language will keep being spoken. The words are written in light, but the meaning lives in the mind that learns to read it. That perhaps is the truest legacy of our first teachers, the reminder that understanding is not owned or inherited, but rediscovered again and again, like constellations returning to the same sky. And as the night stretches onward, the constellations begin to fade toward dawn, their messages absorbed for another day, their voices quiet but not gone. The horizon begins to glow, and somewhere someone is watching it the same way the first learners once did, tracing the light, marking the pattern, remembering what the stars once taught, and what they still have left to teach. When the first seeds were planted, something irreversible happened to the human story. It wasn't just the beginning of agriculture, it was the beginning of memory taking root in the ground. Before that, people followed the world as it moved. They walked with the herds, they followed the rivers, they read the sky as a map of migration. But the moment someone decided to stay, to dig into the soil, to wait, to trust that something invisible would return, humanity changed forever. Fire had already taught us control, but seeds taught us patience. Together they became the first teachers of permanence, and the shape of memory began to shift from wind to earth. Imagine how strange it must have felt the first time someone placed a seed into the ground and walked away believing it would come back as food. It required imagination and trust, the two ingredients that make every human invention possible. Fire gave warmth, safety, and the comfort of repetition. Seeds gave future. Between the two, a new rhythm emerged: work, rest, waiting, harvest. A cycle that tied people not just to the sky but to the land itself. The language of the stars told them when to begin, but the soil was where those lessons took form. At first, the planting was small: wild grasses, fruits, roots. But over time, it became ritual. People learned that different soils held different moods, that water could shape abundance, that patience had texture. The first fields weren't farms as we know them. They were experiments in trust. Each season was a message from the earth, a test of whether humans could remember what the sky had already told them. If they planted too soon, frost destroyed the young shoots. If they waited too long, drought turned the soil to dust. Slowly, over generations, they learned the rhythm, a conversation between the heavens above and the dirt below. Every harvest was an act of memory. The seed had to be saved, guarded, named. Someone had to remember which patch yielded more grain, which rainfall brought success, which moon marked the right time to begin again. That remembering required language, not just for survival, but for cooperation. It's possible that agriculture and speech grew together, one feeding the other. Words allowed people to plan, to measure, to assign meaning to the invisible. The first stories about gods of the soil or mothers of grain weren't superstition. They were gratitude written in metaphor, a way to preserve information in emotion so it would be remembered. The earth was alive, and knowledge was its language. The discovery of fire had been a similar transformation. It gave humans control over an element that had once been only danger. To harness it meant to transform the wild into the familiar, the dark into light, the cold into warmth. Fire turned food digestible, stone workable, night livable. It was the first tool that taught us not just how to survive, but how to shape our environment. In that flickering glow, memory itself began to organize. People gathered, faces illuminated, and stories were born. Around fire, the past became narrative, and narrative became instruction. Every spark carried the same message. The world could be understood, changed, repeated. The first civilization didn't begin in cities. It began in the circle of light that fire cast against the dark. There's a quiet symmetry between fire and seeds. One transforms what already exists. The other creates something new from nothing visible. Together they mirror the two sides of knowledge, invention and preservation. Fire teaches immediacy, the power to act. Seeds teach patience, the art of waiting. Civilization needed both. You can't build permanence without both the impulse to create and the discipline to remember. Maybe that's why both became sacred so early. Fire temples in ancient Persia, hearth rituals in Europe, harvest festivals in every corner of the world, they all share the same essence: reverence for continuity. Even the myths remember this duality. In Greek tradition, Prometheus steals fire from the gods, not just as a tool but as a knowledge itself. It's a story about enlightenment, but also rebellion, the risk of learning too much too fast. In countless indigenous stories, seeds are gifts from ancestors, often carried through great floods or disasters to restart life. They're not just food, they're memory capsules. Each seed contains not only the future of a plant, but the history of every hand that ever saved it. Fire and seeds are both acts of inheritance, the passing forward of what must never be lost. When archaeologists uncover ancient hearths, they often find traces of both: charred grains, carbonized seeds, blackened pottery. The two appear together as though they were never meant to be separate. The oldest known bread, discovered in the desert of Jordan, dates back over 14,000 years, long before organised farming. It suggests that even before agriculture, people were experimenting with plants, roasting and grinding them, transforming nature into nourishment. Fire turned raw food into something communal, something meant to be shared. The act of cooking may have been humanity's first real ceremony. It turned necessity into ritual, and ritual into memory. The same may be true of agriculture. When people began to plant intentionally, they were doing more than feeding themselves, they were stabilizing time. A field requires a calendar, even if it's only remembered in the mind. Someone had to mark when to till, when to sow, when to harvest. Those who remembered became teachers. Their knowledge became power, and power required structure. From that, leadership was born, not in the form of kings or armies, but as guidance. The one who knew when to plant was as essential as the one who knew how to light the fire. Knowledge, once shared freely around the hearth, began to settle into roles, traditions, and authority. Civilization had taken another step toward permanence. You can trace this transition in the soil itself. Early agricultural sites like Jericho and Kut al-Hoyuk show layers of rebuilding, homes made, abandoned, rebuilt again on the same spot for generations. That repetition is memory turned physical. Each layer is a decision to remain, to hold ground, to pass down a place rather than a story. Before that, human memory lived in movement, in songs, in maps of the mind, in tales carried across distances. Now, it had a home. The land itself became a storyteller, its layers a script. Every wall rebuilt was a word in a long, ongoing sentence about belonging. The relationship between seeds, fire, and memory extends beyond metaphor. When people began to store food, they discovered preservation: smoke to dry meat, heat to seal pots, ashes to protect seeds from pests. Each method was an experiment in time, a way to stretch the present into the future. Those who mastered it could plan seasons ahead. With planning came foresight, and with foresight, the idea of legacy. The future became a tangible thing, something that could be prepared for. The shape of human life changed from circular wandering to linear progression. We began to measure not just days, but years, generations, lineage. Fire gave us control over the moment. Seeds gave us control over what comes next. This shift may also explain why memory itself became so deeply tied to ritual. Planting, harvesting, cooking, and sharing food all became ceremonies because they repeated the same story. Death transformed into life, effort rewarded with abundance, knowledge passed through action. Every season became a rehearsal of history. When we light candles, bake bread, or tend gardens today, we are reenacting lessons older than any written record. They are quiet continuations of what the first teachers showed our ancestors. that to tend to something outside yourself is to remember where you came from. If you look at the development of early settlements, you can almost see the physical imprint of memory forming. A hearth at the centre, storage around it, fields beyond, and above all of it, the sky still serving as calendar and compass. Civilization was taking shape as a layered memory. Fire for the present, seeds for the future, stars for orientation. Each element completed the others. Remove one and the pattern collapses. Keep them together and knowledge flows seamlessly through time. Some researchers believe that early agricultural societies developed not just domesticated plants, but domesticated memory, the habit of recording, cataloguing and repeating information. Tokens used to represent grain became symbols, which became writing. Clay tablets marked with impressions were the earliest bookkeeping devices, tracking stores and exchanges. From this, the first scripts were born. In a way, language itself sprouted from seeds and fire. The need to remember what was planted, what was stored, what was owed, what was shared. Words became vessels for continuity. This intertwining of the physical and the mental shaped not only our environment but our minds. Neuroscientists studying memory often describe it as associative. New information links to old. Early humans didn't just memorize facts, they lived them. Planting was an act of recollection. Cooking was an act of inheritance. The body learned through repetition what the mind might forget. That's why so much ancient knowledge survived orally for millennia. It was embedded in rhythm, in motion, in daily practice. Civilization, before it was written, was performed. Even the first monuments may have grown from this impulse to preserve the pattern. The same patience that guided planting could have guided the placement of stones. Both acts are about alignment, of hand, of tool, of intention. A farmer aligning rows of crops and a builder aligning stones to the stars were practicing the same discipline, turning observation into permanence. That unity of purpose carried across continents may explain why agriculture and architecture appeared together in so many places. When people learned to cultivate the land, they also learned to cultivate memory. Over time, the balance between seed and fire became a symbol for larger ideas. In myth, fire often represents intellect, and seeds represent renewal. Together, they form a cycle, knowledge that illuminates and sustains. It's possible that ancient philosophers inherited this duality without even realizing its origin. To create something and to nurture it are two sides of the same instinct that began tens of thousands of years earlier around campfires and gardens. The shape of human thought itself mirrors that pattern. Inspiration sparks like fire, and understanding grows slowly like a seed. There's a quiet beauty in realizing how much of our world still depends on those same lessons. Every time a new idea is born, it passes through both processes. It ignites, then it grows. Innovation is the fire, practice is the seed. You can see it in everything from art to science. And perhaps that's why these ancient symbols still resonate. They describe not just history, but the architecture of thought itself. When archaeologists uncover charred layers of earth from prehistoric fires, they sometimes find seeds preserved perfectly in the ash. The same flames that destroyed the surface preserved what lay within. It's a fitting metaphor for civilization, fragile, cyclical, constantly burning and regrowing. Every era consumes the one before, yet carries its essence forward. The fire of knowledge never really extinguishes, it simply changes form, passing from torch to torch, from generation to generation. If the first civilization truly existed, it might have understood this principle instinctively. To teach humanity the use of fire and the art of planting would have been to teach them how to carry knowledge forward without depending on memory alone. These were technologies of endurance, lessons that could survive even when language failed. If all else was lost, as long as people knew how to light fire and plant seeds, the world could begin again. That's not just survival, that's design. And so, long after that civilization faded, its lessons remained. Every spark struck from stone, every field turned by hand, every meal shared around flame was a repetition of that first instruction. The act itself became the message. To remember how to create, to preserve, to renew, that was the curriculum written into our instincts. Even now in the electric light of modern life, when we cook, when we plant, when we gather to share what we've made, we're still speaking that ancient language of continuation. Somewhere beneath all our layers of technology and progress, those original lessons still guide us quietly. Fire still defines our relationship with transformation. Seeds still define our relationship with time. Memory still shapes everything in between. They are the simplest and most profound of inheritances, proof that the first teachers didn't just build structures or calendars. They built habits, ways of seeing, doing, and believing that outlasted even their names. The earth remembers those habits. Every harvest echoes the first. Every flame carries the same warmth that once gathered people together in the dark. The pattern remains unbroken, even if its origin is forgotten. The hands that tend it may have changed, but the rhythm has not. Humanity, in all its complexity, still runs on the same quiet truths. We burn, we plant, we wait, we learn. The shape of memory still grows from the same soil where those first seeds once fell, and somewhere beyond the horizon, beneath the endless turning of the stars, the next part of that memory waits to be uncovered, in the waters that once swallowed its beginning, and in the stories that remember what the ocean took away. The ocean has always been both boundary and bridge. It divides continents, yet connects them in ways that land never could. For early humans, it must have been both mystery and memory, a vast moving mirror of the sky they had learned to read. The stars gave them time, the land gave them roots, but the sea held the past. It swallowed coastlines, erased cities, and kept its secrets quiet beneath layers of salt and silt. If the first civilization ever truly existed, this is where its bones would rest, not on the land we know, but under the waves we've forgotten to look beneath. When the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago, the planet changed in ways that would have seemed almost supernatural to anyone alive then. Temperatures rose, ice melted, and the oceans began to climb. They didn't rush in like a single great flood. They crept upward, decade by decade, swallowing coast after coast. Whole valleys became bays, rivers became estuaries, islands disappeared beneath the water, along with everything built upon them. By the time the sea reached its modern level, millions of square kilometres of land had vanished. It was enough to erase entire worlds without leaving a trace. For most of human history, those vanished places were just stories. Legends of lands lost to the sea exist in nearly every culture. Atlantis in the west, Lemuria in the east, Kumarikandam in the south, Hy-Brasil in the north. At first glance, they sound like myth, fragments of imagination trying to make sense of nature's violence. But what if those stories are memories? What if they're the cultural echoes of real floods, real lands, and real people who saw their world drown? Modern science gives some weight to that possibility. Archaeologists have mapped ancient shorelines now buried far below the surface, vast coastal plains that once connected regions we know today as separate. In Southeast Asia, what is now the scattered islands of Indonesia and Malaysia was once a single landmass called Sunderland. It would have been lush, fertile, and home to rivers and valleys perfect for settlement. When the sea rose, it became an archipelago, scattering its inhabitants like seeds across the ocean. Their descendants still tell stories of ancestral homelands beneath the waves. In the Indian Ocean, the same pattern appears. The submerged ruins off the coast of India, near Dwarka and the Gulf of Cambay, suggest structures older than known civilizations. They're debated fiercely. Some call them natural formations, others remnants of cities. But if even one of them is real, the implications ripple far. The ocean doesn't preserve in the way land does. Wood decays, metal corrodes, silt buries. Time underwater is ruthless. Yet it also protects. Layers of sand and salt create a kind of oblivion that is also preservation. Beneath them, there may still lie traces. Stone foundations, carvings, the geometry of a world we've never seen. Every now and then a storm uncovers something. A wall here, a path there, fragments of pottery that seem too old for their depth. Divers who explore these sites often describe the feeling of entering another world, one that feels hauntingly familiar yet unreachable, like a dream retold by the planet itself. It's easy to imagine how such losses shape the human mind. Imagine watching the sea eat your home, your fields, your ancestors' graves. Imagine walking inland as the water follows, relentless and cold, until the horizon itself changes shape. The world you knew would vanish, and with it, the proof that it ever existed. Only story would remain. Perhaps that's why flood myths are so consistent across time and geography. They aren't imagination, they're memory, carried like seeds through migration, and told again and again until their origins blurred into legend. A people that survived a global transformation would remember it as divine punishment or cosmic renewal, because how else could it be understood? The more you study those myths, the more they align with real geological events. The Sumerians wrote of a flood that destroyed the world, echoed later in the Hebrew Bible. The Greeks told of Deucalion, who built a vessel to survive rising waters. The Hopi, the Maori, the Mayans, all remember floods that ended an age and began another. Science calls it the end of the Pleistocene, when glaciers melted and the Holocene began. The people who lived through it called it the end of everything, and maybe for them, it was. If a civilization had existed before that change, one capable of teaching, of building, of guiding early humanity, the sea would have taken almost all evidence of it. Coastal cities are always the first to thrive, because the sea gives both food and travel. They're also the first to disappear. If an advanced society had risen during the Ice Age, it would have lived near the coasts, trading and building along shores that no longer exist. When the floods came, it would have been erased so completely that even its ruins became myths. Only its students would remain, scattered across the continents, carrying fragments of its knowledge like embers in the dark. You can see echoes of that idea in the way the earliest known civilizations seem to begin near the sea, as if drawn back to what was lost. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, all began near fertile river deltas, where fresh water met salt. It's almost as if humanity was retracing old steps, rebuilding what had once been familiar. The same patterns repeat: agriculture, monumental architecture, astronomy, trade. It's not proof of inheritance, but it feels like remembrance. The ocean may have taken the original, but its reflection remained in us. There are hints in ancient maps too, traces of coastlines that shouldn't have been known. The Piri Reis map drawn in 1513 shows parts of Antarctica's coastline beneath ice, mapped centuries before modern exploration. Some claim it's coincidence, others that it's a copy of older charts now lost. Whatever the case, the idea persists that knowledge survived the flood, passed from one age to another through those who fled rising water. It's a haunting image. Sailors crossing new seas guided by memories of an old one, searching for lands that no longer existed, carrying stories of teachers who vanished beneath the waves. But perhaps the ocean's greatest secret isn't physical at all. Perhaps it's the reminder of impermanence, that everything humans build, no matter how grand, can be reclaimed by nature without a trace. The sea erases with the same patience it teaches. It reminds us that permanence is an illusion, that knowledge, not monuments, is what truly survives. The first civilization might have understood this too well. Maybe that's why they taught through ideas rather than artifacts. Maybe they knew that memory has to be carried within, not just built upon the earth. Even today, the ocean continues to shape what we know and what we forget. Its depths remain less explored than the surfaces of other planets. We send probes to Mars but still know almost nothing about the seabed beneath us. It's an irony that would have made sense to the first navigators. The idea that our greatest unknown lies right beside us. Perhaps the ocean hides more than ruins. Perhaps it hides continuity. The unbroken line between us and those who lived before history, a line traced not in stone, but in migration, myth, and instinct. Consider how humans have always returned to the sea when seeking origin. We call it the cradle of life, the mirror of the cosmos. Our blood carries its salt. Our earliest ancestors crawled from its depths. It's where life began, and for countless stories where wisdom sleeps. In myth, the ocean is both mother and memory. The Greeks imagined wisdom rising from its foam. The Polynesians described gods arriving across its surface in canoes of light. The Celts spoke of islands that vanished at dawn, where knowledge waited for those brave enough to seek it. These aren't random fictions. They're metaphors built from observation, the tide's rhythm, the star's reflection, the sense that beneath the surface something vast remembers everything. When sailors from the earliest known civilization took to the sea, they carried that same reverence. Their voyages weren't reckless. They followed stars, winds, and currents with the precision of inherited knowledge. Polynesian navigators, for instance, could cross thousands of miles without instruments, guided by constellations, waves, and the flight paths of birds. They read the ocean as fluently as others read maps. That skill didn't appear suddenly. It was cultivated through generations of teaching, preserved through ritual and story. Perhaps it's one of the few direct survivals of a tradition older than civilization itself, a way of seeing the world as a living, interconnected system of signs. To navigate was to remember. Some researchers believe the same tradition might explain how distant ancient cultures seem to have shared symbols and measurements. Similar motifs appear across continents: spirals, sun disks, serpents, and waves. It's possible they all arose independently, but it's also possible that they're remnants of shared knowledge carried by seafarers who moved between lands long before we think they could. If the sea once connected a global culture, its traces might still be visible not in artifacts but in symbols. A spiral, for instance, can represent water, the sun, time, or rebirth. It appears in the carvings of Ireland, the temples of Mexico, the pottery of Japan, the rock art of Australia. It's as if the ocean, with its endless motion, impressed its pattern onto the human imagination. The same is true for the serpent, a creature often associated with both water and wisdom. Across mythologies, serpents guard hidden knowledge or dwell in deep waters. They're neither good nor evil. They're keepers of cycles, symbols of transformation. Perhaps they represent the sea itself. Vast, dangerous, but essential. To cross it is to risk death. To understand it is to survive. The serpent is the teacher disguised as a threat. The reminder that knowledge must be earned through humility. If the ocean does keep secrets, they're likely not waiting in some grand lost city glittering under the waves. They're quieter than that. Fragments of culture, strands of continuity, lessons that survived the flood by being small enough to travel unnoticed. A method of navigation, a ritual of planting, a song that measures the stars. These are the real ruins of the first civilization, invisible, portable, and alive. We still carry them, often without realizing it. The way we measure time, the symbols we carve, the rituals we repeat, they all whisper of origins we can no longer see. There's a strange comfort in the idea that forgetting can also be a form of preservation. The flood may have erased the structures, but it forced the knowledge to become internal. When land disappears, memory becomes nomadic. It adapts, moves, reshapes itself. In that way, the ocean didn't destroy civilization. It transformed it. It scattered the seeds so far that no single wave could drown them all. The modern world has begun to rediscover traces of that transformation. Submerged forests, ancient riverbeds, and ruins hidden beneath sandbanks are appearing as sonar and satellite mapping improve. Each discovery expands the story of humanity further into the past. Yet, what's most striking isn't the scale of what was lost, but the endurance of what survived. We may never find the cities themselves, but their lessons are everywhere. In the instinct to watch the horizon, in the urge to cross what seems uncrossable, in the way we still feel awe when we face the sea. If you stand by the ocean at night and listen long enough, you can almost hear the rhythm that connects it all. The tide pulling, the wind answering, the stars mirrored in the waves. It's the same rhythm that early humans must have heard, the same that carried their memories forward. The sea speaks slowly, but it never stops speaking. Its language is patience, its alphabet is motion, and its meaning is change. Everything that lives learns it eventually. How to move with its currents, how to yield and return, how to remember through rhythm instead of record. Perhaps that's the final lesson of the ocean that kept secrets. Not that it hides a lost world, but that it embodies the truth of all worlds, that nothing remains by staying still, and that even what is forgotten continues in another form. The first civilization may have vanished beneath the waves, but its influence moves through us like currents, unseen but constant. We carry it every time we look toward the horizon and feel the pull to know what lies beyond. The water will always remember, even if we no longer can. And somewhere, deep beneath its surface, the shape of what once was still waits, quiet, patient, unbroken, as if the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for us to listen again. If the ocean remembers what we've lost, then myths are the voices that try to translate those memories. They are the sound of history spoken through dream, carrying meaning even when the facts are gone. When we listen carefully to ancient stories, what we hear isn't fantasy. It's record-keeping without paper, a language invented by people who had no tools for writing yet still refused to forget. Before dates and maps, there were tales. Before archives, there were firesides and storytellers who spoke in symbols. And behind those symbols, hidden in rhythm and metaphor, there is often something real, an event, a place, a truth softened by time. Every civilization we know has a set of myths about beginnings, floods, fire, and the arrival of knowledge. They may differ in setting or names, but their patterns are nearly identical. Gods or teachers descend from the sky, or rise from the sea, or appear from the wilderness, bringing light, tools, language, or law. Then, after teaching what must be learned, they depart, sometimes returning to the heavens, sometimes disappearing beneath the water. It's an almost universal story, and like all universal stories, it likely points to something shared, not just an invention of imagination, but a collective memory of real encounters, remembered so long that fact and symbol fuse together. It's tempting to read myths as fiction, because they speak in images instead of evidence. But long before writing, metaphor was the safest container for memory. A story could survive where a structure could not. You could lose your city, your library, your king, but as long as someone remembered the story, knowledge would remain alive. It could travel, adapt, and survive disaster. The oldest myths are structured for durability. They're layered, repetitive, easy to recite, hard to erase. They were never just entertainment. They were instruction disguised as wonder. In the ruins of ancient Sumer, the earliest written records we have are already retellings of older oral traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of a great flood, a divine warning, and a survivor who preserves life on a boat. Long before that story was carved in clay, it was spoken in the dark, maybe by people who had watched waters rise and sweep their homes away. When you read it closely, you can feel that urgency, the sense of something witnessed, not imagined. Its details mirror geological events around the end of the Ice Age, when rivers in Mesopotamia flooded unpredictably as the climate shifted. Over centuries, that event turned into a parable, one that carried practical wisdom. Build higher, prepare, remember. That same story with different names travels through time. Noah and his ark in the Hebrew texts, Deucalion in Greek myth, Manu in the Hindu Puranas, Utnapishtim in Babylonian clay, all warn of water and the end of an age. It's as if humanity refused to forget what the ocean had done, even if the world itself changed shape. Myths became our first maps of trauma, not of geography, but of survival. And it isn't only floods. Myths about fire, its theft, its gift, its danger, appear everywhere. In Greece, Prometheus gives fire to humans and is punished for it. In Polynesia, Maui steals fire from the underworld. In the Americas, the raven brings it to humankind. In each case, fire represents knowledge, something transformative, something that changes the relationship between people and nature. Those stories may have begun as literal events, the moment someone learned to preserve flame or create it from friction, but they grew into symbols because their meaning was too important to lose. Myths took real innovation and turned it into heritage. Other myths tell of beings who arrive from the sky, not in the mechanical sense modern imagination often pictures, but as luminous visitors, as messengers of light. To ancient people, the sky was both home of the gods and the source of all order. To say that wisdom came from above wasn't necessarily superstition. It may have been a poetic way to remember who the first teachers were, people who seemed to carry knowledge from far away, from directions marked by stars. When the Dogon people of Mali speak of beings from the Sirius system teaching them astronomy, skeptics call it coincidence. Yet the Dogon had knowledge of Sirius's companion star, invisible to the naked eye, long before telescopes. Whether learned through oral transmission or observation, the result is the same. Knowledge carried across ages, explained through story because story is what survives. If we line up the myths of different civilizations like pages from a book, we begin to see recurring motifs, patterns that repeat too neatly to be accidental. A flood, a teacher, a loss, a renewal. The details shift, but the structure stays. These are not isolated imaginations. They are variations on memory, each retold through the lens of place and culture. The Mayans spoke of the gods remaking humanity after earlier attempts failed. The Egyptians told of Thoth, the divine scribe who taught writing and number. The Mesopotamians had Owans, a being from the sea who taught agriculture and architecture. The Greeks had Hermes, the messenger who bridged heaven and earth. The pattern continues through time. Teachers arrive, share knowledge, and depart. The stories may exaggerate, but they preserve a truth. Learning itself felt like a visitation. Knowledge entered the world as if from another realm. This is what makes myth so powerful. It's history told from the inside, emotional truth shaped into narrative form. The people who told these stories weren't documenting. They were remembering through emotion, turning experience into something that could be carried across centuries. A community that lost everything in a flood could still pass down its lessons if it turned them into divine acts. A people who met strangers with strange skills could immortalize them as gods. In this way, the divine often begins as gratitude. Worship is memory dressed in awe. When anthropologists compare ancient stories from across the planet, they sometimes find linguistic traces that hint at shared ancestry. Certain words, certain symbols, even similar rhythms of speech echo between distant cultures. The idea of sacred duality, sun and moon, earth and sky, life and death, appears in every known mythology. It may reflect the simplest observation of opposites in nature, but it might also be a clue to shared instruction. Perhaps the first teachers used this duality as a framework for understanding balance, a teaching simple enough to survive even when all else was forgotten. Myths preserved it because myths thrive on contrast, creation and destruction, gift and punishment, ascent and fall. The shape of story mirrors the shape of reality. Even the great cycles of time found in Hindu cosmology, the yugas, or the concept of repeating ages in Greek and Mesoamerican thought, might come from an awareness of long-term change handed down through generations. They suggest that the ancients knew the world moved not just in daily or yearly cycles, but in epochs. The Ice Age's end would have felt like the turning of such an age, the planet itself changing rules. To explain that, storytellers might have created the idea of cosmic renewal, where humanity rises, falls and rises again. It's the same rhythm we see in nature, magnified to a universal scale. But myth doesn't only remember disaster, it also remembers structure, how to build, how to measure, how to balance. The Egyptians spoke of Ma'at, the divine order of harmony and proportion. The Chinese had Tao, the way of balance in all things. These ideas are philosophical now, but their origin may be practical. Lessons about architecture, law and governance expressed through spiritual language. Teaching people how to build a stable society is easier when framed as living in harmony with divine order. The line between science and story was never clear-cut. In myth, they were the same language spoken differently. The persistence of these motifs, the flood, the fire, the teacher, the balance, hints that myths are more than cultural coincidences. They're a record of how knowledge travels when writing does not exist. When a community moves or collapses, its stories go with its survivors. They adapt to new climates, new gods, new names. Over thousands of years, they merge and evolve until what was once instruction becomes legend. But if you strip away the divine and the dramatic, you often find something practical underneath. Star charts, agricultural calendars, moral codes, survival guides. Myth is the scaffolding of civilization's memory. In that sense, myths are like fossils of thought. They preserve the shape of what once lived, even when the original substance is gone. To study them is to reverse engineer the evolution of human understanding. Every story of gods descending or waters rising is a doorway to an earlier moment, when memory was fragile and imagination was the only way to keep it alive. Myths remember not because they are accurate, but because they are resilient. They are the hard shells that protect the soft truths within. It's telling that myths and history only began to separate once writing became common. When people could record events directly, the need for symbolic memory lessened. History became a sequence of facts, dates, rulers, wars. Myth became something else, the dreamlike residue of what no longer fit the factual world. But before that division, there was no difference. To speak of the gods was to speak of events. To retell creation was to explain geology. To describe the heavens was to teach astronomy. Every story was both science and ceremony. The separation is a modern luxury. For our ancestors, myth was the encyclopedia of existence. Perhaps this is why the stories still feel alive when facts grow cold. They were meant to be felt, not studied. The emotional memory within them makes them durable. Facts fade when they lose relevance. Stories adapt. The myth of Atlantis, for example, has survived thousands of years not because it's verifiable, but because it speaks to something universal. The fear of losing what we've built. The idea that wisdom and pride can collapse together. Whether Plato invented it as metaphor or echoed an older tale, its endurance suggests resonance. People recognize themselves in it. Myths don't survive because they're true. They survive because they're useful. And yet, within that usefulness, truth still hides. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, describing it as an advanced society destroyed in a single day and night by water and fire. His story may have been philosophical, but the details echo real events at the end of the Ice Age. The flooding of coastlines, the eruptions that followed melting glaciers, the sudden collapse of ecosystems. Myth works this way. It exaggerates to preserve scale. If an event feels world-ending, it becomes a tale of the whole world's end. When we listen to these old stories now, we tend to interpret them through science, searching for evidence. But maybe the better approach is to listen to their tone, what they valued, what they feared, what they wanted to preserve. In that tone, you can still hear the humanity behind the divinity. You can hear parents telling children how to stay alive, elders teaching through parable, because fact alone isn't enough to inspire memory. Myth transforms instruction into something emotionally unforgettable. That's why it still reaches us. Even in the modern world, stripped of ritual and reverence, we still make myths. They take new forms, novels, films, technologies, but they serve the same purpose. They turn the incomprehensible into something you can hold in your mind. Every era retells the same core stories because they're the framework of understanding itself. A society that forgets them risks forgetting not just its past, but the instincts that built it. Maybe that's why myths endure so quietly in our culture, disguised as archetypes, metaphors, symbols. They continue the same function they always had, carrying knowledge across the fragile bridge of time. When myths remember what history forgets, they do so by appealing to what never changes, the human need to find meaning in the patterns of existence. Whether or not a first civilization truly taught early humans everything, the memory of that teaching survived through myth. Every god of knowledge, every story of descent, every tale of rebirth is a piece of that inheritance, worn smooth by countless retellings, but still recognizable. You can think of mythology as humanity's deep memory, the part that resists erosion. While written history is fragile, dependent on libraries and preservation, myth lives in speech and repetition. It moves through people like breath, changing shape but never ceasing. It's the ocean of the mind, constantly shifting, always the same. And like the real ocean, it hides within its depth the outlines of a lost continent, waiting for someone to listen long enough to trace their shape again. When you listen closely to myths, not just read them but feel their rhythm, you begin to sense that continuity. The voice of an elder telling a story 5,000 years ago sounds almost like the voice of a scientist explaining the universe today. Both are trying to make sense of mystery. Both are trying to preserve wonder. Both are trying to pass it on. The difference is language, not purpose. Myth, in that way, isn't a relic of superstition. It's the first science of meaning. And as the mind drifts between thought and memory, between night and imagination, you can almost see how the first storytellers looked into the dark and decided that forgetting was the only real danger. So they built their memory into tales that could survive flood, fire, and silence. Stories that would outlive cities, languages, and even time itself. Those stories are still with us, still speaking, still teaching what was once known. And through them, the next part of the mystery unfolds, leading us from the memory of gods to the maps that shouldn't exist, to the strange persistence of knowledge that refuses to stay lost. There is something strange about maps. Even the simplest ones carry an authority that stories or legends cannot match. A map suggests certainty, a claim that the world has been measured, named, and understood. Yet, when you look at the oldest maps, the ones drawn when much of the earth was still a mystery, there's a quiet contradiction hiding beneath their ink. They show too much. Coastlines that should not have been known, shapes of continents drawn centuries before explorers could have seen them, details that seem to belong to an older memory. It's as if someone long before history began had already traced the outline of the planet, then passed the knowledge forward in fragments, scattered through generations waiting for rediscovery. A map is a form of memory made visible. It's not only geography, it's inheritance. To draw one is to claim that you've seen, or that someone before you has. The first maps that survive on clay or parchment show more than land. They show thought. The Sumerian map of Nippur, the Babylonian map of the world, the Egyptian depictions of their kingdom's boundaries, all reveal an awareness that land has shape, that distance can be represented, that direction is not random. Yet even these early examples seem to begin mid-sentence, as if the art of mapping was already known. There is no clear origin, no first map that explains the rest. The knowledge appears already mature, as though inherited from a tradition that existed before recorded civilization. The most famous example of this mystery is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who claimed to have based it on much older sources. The surviving fragment shows the western coasts of Africa and South America, with surprising accuracy for its time, but what draws the most curiosity is the lower section, an outline of what appears to be Antarctica, shown without its ice. According to modern geology, that coastline has been hidden beneath ice for tens of thousands of years. To depict it correctly would require either seismic mapping or a record from an era before the ice returned. Mainstream historians explain it as coincidence or misinterpretation, a distortion of South America's southern tip. But still, the map feels unsettling, like an echo of knowledge that shouldn't exist. The Piri Reis map isn't alone. Other early maps show anomalies that hint at forgotten sources. The Orontius Phineus map from the 16th century also outlines Antarctica in detail, complete with mountain ranges that match modern surveys beneath the ice. The Boachi map, drawn in the 18th century, divides the continent into regions corresponding to geological structures we only discovered through modern technology. Even earlier, medieval maps like the Zeno chart depict islands in the North Atlantic that no longer exist, perhaps remnants of lands swallowed by post-Ice Age seas. Each of these cases, taken alone, might be coincidence. Together they form a pattern too consistent to dismiss outright. It suggests that the cartographers were copying from documents much older than their own time, records of an Earth different from the one they knew. If that's true, it raises a quiet but profound question. Who made those original maps, and when? The simplest answer is that humans, far earlier than we think, had already begun to explore. That long before written history, there may have been seafarers with the skill to chart coastlines, to measure latitude using the stars, to preserve and pass that knowledge onward. If such a culture existed during the last ice age, their maps would have survived only if copied and recopied across civilizations. Each generation might have drawn the world as best they could, updating it, distorting it, misunderstanding pieces but keeping the overall memory intact. By the time the Ottomans or the Greeks or the Egyptians inherited the fragments, they would have seen them as relics, sacred diagrams from an earlier age, their meaning half understood but too important to discard. That idea sounds improbable, yet the evidence we do have of ancient navigation makes it less so. The Polynesians, for instance, crossed thousands of kilometres of open ocean without compasses or charts, using only the stars, the colour of the water, and the flight of birds. The ancient Egyptians may have sailed down the Red Sea and around the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps even farther. The Phoenicians are said to have circumnavigated Africa centuries before European explorers repeated the feat. All of these examples show that long-distance navigation without modern tools is not only possible but practical when guided by accumulated knowledge. Now imagine such skill existing thousands of years earlier, during a time when coastlines stretched farther out, when islands connected what are now distant lands. A global maritime culture could have thrived and vanished with barely a trace, leaving behind only fragments, a compass carved in stone here, a myth of a sea journey there, and perhaps, if we're lucky, a map copied onto animal skin or clay. What makes maps so intriguing is how they outlive intention. Once drawn, they take on a life of their own. A merchant may copy a coastline from rumour, a scholar may redraw it with more precision. Centuries later, an explorer holds the same image and believes he's discovering something new, unaware that his path was already known in another age. Knowledge has a way of resurfacing, wearing new names each time. A coastline rediscovered is still the same coastline. A chart redrawn is still an echo of its first line. In that sense, maps are like myths, repeating, adapting, surviving through change. The farther back we look, the more that connection between story and geography becomes apparent. Myths often describe lands that vanish, islands that rise, journeys across impossible distances. Modern readers call them allegories. but their details sometimes align with real geography too precisely to ignore. The Greek tale of Atlantis places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean, west of Europe. The Aztec legends speak of Aztlan, a homeland across the sea to the east. The Irish spoke of Hybrasil, a phantom island that appeared and disappeared off their coast. Each of these could be independent invention, or they could be cultural memories of real lands lost to rising seas. If the first map makers recorded such places, the maps might have carried their memory long after the lands themselves were gone. The connection between mythology and mapping goes even deeper when we remember that ancient people saw no division between the physical and the spiritual. To chart the world was also to describe creation. The Egyptians' maps of the Duat, their underworld, are as precise as their maps of the Nile. The Babylonians placed their known lands inside a cosmic ocean, surrounded by circles of mountains and mystery. Even the Greeks filled their margins with gods and monsters, not because they believed the world was magical, but because they understood that beyond knowledge, imagination must fill the gaps. In this way, ancient maps are more honest than modern ones. They admit what they do not know. They leave room for memory and fear, for legend and possibility. Perhaps that's why the anomalies on old maps feel so striking. They are glimpses of a moment when the unknown and the known overlapped, when memory of an earlier Earth still lingered in the margins. A coastline drawn too far south, a mountain range placed where no one had been, an island too perfectly shaped to be invention. Each could be a distortion, or each could be the fading imprint of a world that once existed before the sea rose. It's easy to imagine a chain of transmission stretching across millennia. An Ice Age navigator records coastlines, his descendants redraw them, his maps decay, and fragments are passed to later civilizations, copied again and again until their origins blur into myth. By the time we rediscover them, we call them mysteries. Modern science offers another layer of intrigue. Satellite mapping of the seafloor has revealed features that match descriptions once dismissed as myth. Submerged plateaus, ancient riverbeds, and continental shelves that would have been dry land during the last glacial period. The shapes align in some cases with the outlines of lost lands described in legend. Of course, correlation isn't proof, but the convergence of memory, story, and geology suggests that our ancestors knew more than we often give them credit for. They didn't need satellites to sense pattern. They needed time, patience, and memory, the same tools that built their calendars and temples. There's also the curious precision of latitude and longitude implied by some ancient structures. The Great Pyramid's location, for instance, corresponds closely to the geographic centre of the Earth's land masses. That may be coincidence, but combined with its near-perfect alignment to true north, it suggests awareness of global geometry. To place a monument so precisely requires either extraordinary luck or inherited knowledge of planetary scale. Perhaps what we see in the stones is not just architecture, but cartography in another form. The planet itself used as the map. If the first civilization truly existed, it may have recorded its world in ways we no longer recognize, not on parchment, but in orientation, in proportion, in geometry. The ancient science of sacred geography, practiced in Egypt, China, and the Andes, treats land as living symbol. Temples are placed according to stars, cities align with solstices, mountain peaks form triangles that mirror constellations. This blending of heaven and earth is another kind of mapping, one that preserves cosmology through landscape. To read those alignments is to read a map written in terrain, a record of how the ancients saw their world connected. Maps older than maps should be might not look like charts at all. They might be stories, songs, or pilgrim routes. Indigenous Australian songlines, for instance, encode geography through melody. Each verse describes a path, a landmark, a water source. When sung in sequence, they form a map you can travel by ear. Polynesian stick charts use curved rods to represent ocean swells, shells to mark islands, and crosspieces to show current patterns. These are not primitive forms of mapping. They are languages of motion, portable, adaptable, alive. They remind us that a map's purpose is not to show the world as it is, but to help us move through it. Perhaps that's the lesson the oldest maps tried to preserve. The first civilization, if it taught early humans anything, might have taught them how to orient, not just physically, but mentally, in a world that was always changing. To map is to impose order on chaos, to say, this is where I am, and this is where I am going. Even today, every digital map on every screen continues that impulse. We still seek the comfort of coordinates, the reassurance that we can find our way back. The instinct is ancient, older than compasses, older than cities. It may even be older than memory itself. What makes this idea both haunting and beautiful is that, in a way, the maps themselves have done what they describe. They have travelled. They have survived journeys across oceans of time, changed shape, been redrawn, translated, misunderstood, yet somehow preserved their essence. The desire to know where we are in relation to everything else. Even when wrong, they point us toward the same truth, that the act of mapping is an act of remembering. To study them is to participate in that memory. Each strange line or misplaced coast is a whisper from an earlier mind trying to make sense of the world. Maybe the lines we call errors were once correct, drawn from a perspective we can no longer see. The continents have shifted, the poles have moved, ice has come and gone. Perhaps what we read as inaccuracy is simply an older version of reality, one that belonged to a world before ours. If so, the maps are not mistakes. They are time capsules preserving the Earth as it once was. Standing before one of these maps, yellowed with age, the ink faded and edges torn, it's hard not to feel the same quiet awe the original map makers must have felt. They were trying to grasp something too large for a lifetime, to hold the whole world in their hands, to understand it, to mark it, to remember it. In that sense, every map, no matter how ancient or modern, is a fragment of the same quest that began when our ancestors first looked up at the stars and saw in their movement the pattern of home. And so the story continues, from the heavens to the oceans to the lines drawn between them. Each mark, each myth, each rediscovery folds back into the same question. How much of what we call new is really something remembered? The old maps don't answer outright. They simply wait, patient as the knowledge they carry, pointing toward the next mystery, the one written not in ink or stone but within us, encoded in the lineage of thought itself, in the silent inheritance we carry in our very being. Memory has always been our way of holding on to the past, but the kind of memory we usually talk about, the one made of words, symbols and stories, isn't the only one we possess. There is another kind, quieter and deeper, that doesn't live in books or even in the mind. It lives in the body. It shapes how we see, how we move, how we react, and sometimes how we dream. We rarely notice it because it works silently, like the rhythm of breathing or the pulse beneath the skin. But if you look closely at humanity as a whole, at the instincts we share, the fears that come uninvited, the skills that seem to awaken without explanation, you start to sense that memory might not just be something we make. It might be something we inherit. Our DNA is often described as a code, a set of instructions for building the body. But in a way, it's also a story, a record of survival written in chemical letters. Each gene carries not only information about what we are, but about what our ancestors endured to become us. When the environment changes, when danger strikes, when life adapts, those experiences leave traces. They're not memories in the sense of pictures or words, but patterns of reaction and resilience. The ability to digest certain foods, to resist certain diseases, to feel anxiety in the dark, these are the body's way of remembering. They are the fossils of experience, passed from one generation to the next. Modern science calls this field epigenetics, the study of how experience can change the way genes behave. It shows that memory doesn't have to stay in the mind. When an animal faces stress, scarcity, or trauma, its body records that event at a molecular level. Chemical tags attached to DNA, switching certain genes on or off. Those changes can sometimes be passed down, meaning that descendants inherit not just genetic code, but a predisposition shaped by what their ancestors went through. Mice exposed to a particular smell paired with a shock, for example, have offspring that react fearfully to the same smell, even though those offspring have never been shocked. It's as if the experience of fear itself was inherited, encoded directly into biology. If that's true for mice, then what does it mean for us? Could the same thing happen in humans? Could the body remember what the mind forgets? Evidence suggests it can. Studies on children and grandchildren of people who lived through famine, war, or displacement show differences in metabolism, stress response, and even emotional regulation. It's as though their bodies carry echoes of conditions they never personally experienced. A population that once endured scarcity might pass down thriftiness in how its cells store fat. A family that survived trauma might pass down sensitivity to danger, vigilance written into nervous systems generations later. These aren't just metaphors. They are measurable, chemical signatures of a lived experience that time alone cannot erase. That idea, that memory can travel through the body, adds a new dimension to what we call ancestry. We often think of inheritance as physical traits, the shape of a face, the colour of eyes, the pattern of height or voice. But beneath that there is a subtler inheritance of tendencies, instincts, affinities. It may explain why certain places or sounds feel familiar without reason, why we carry unspoken fears, or why we sometimes repeat patterns we don't understand. Our genes are not blank slates waiting for the environment to write upon them. They are living documents, revised by every generation, full of footnotes written by survival. If we think of the first civilization, the one that might have taught early humans everything, it's worth asking how much of their teaching truly had to be spoken. If knowledge can travel through behaviour and biology, maybe not all of it was. A group that learned to build, to plan, to cooperate, would pass those skills not only through instruction but through adaptation. Over generations, the capacity for learning itself could change. The mind, shaped by culture, could also shape the body. The neural circuits that store language, the hands that grasp and carve, the eyes that measure distance and symmetry. All of these evolved under pressure from culture as much as from nature. In that sense, civilization didn't just create knowledge, it rewired the species to sustain it. This possibility blurs the line between biology and history. The story of humanity isn't only the story of tools and cities, but of bodies adapting to the knowledge they carried. When people began to settle and farm, new genes emerged for digesting grains and milk. When they moved into colder climates, new genes regulated temperature and skin colour. When they formed societies, cooperation became a survival trait and empathy grew stronger. These weren't external inventions, they were internal changes, biology learning to remember culture. The mind shaped the body as the body shaped the mind until both became inseparable. If the first teachers truly existed, their lessons might still live within us, not as myths or monuments, but as instincts that feel natural because they were learned too long ago to feel new. It's difficult to separate what we've been taught from what we've inherited. Consider how infants come into the world with reflexes that seem to anticipate knowledge, grasping, sucking, recognizing faces. These are ancient memories, species-level instructions. But beyond those, there are tendencies that seem cultural yet appear early. Studies have shown that babies only months old can distinguish between tones used in language, between symmetrical and asymmetrical patterns, between emotional expressions. They arrive ready to learn certain things, as if their brains expect the world to have structure. That expectation itself is a kind of memory. It's what allows knowledge to accumulate rather than restart each generation. If memory truly shapes our biology, then perhaps the deep past is not as lost as it seems. The first civilization may have disappeared, but the adaptations it sparked could have spread far beyond its borders. The drive to cooperate, the desire to record, the instinct to align with nature's cycles, all could be inherited echoes of that early instruction. We don't need to remember their words to continue their work. The impulse itself survives in us, written in the chemistry of thought and emotion. When we look at the night sky and feel wonder, we might be reenacting the same neural patterns that the first stargazers experienced, carried forward across tens of thousands of years. This kind of continuity reshapes how we think about progress. We often imagine knowledge as something built, stacked one discovery atop another. But what if it's also something grown, rooted in the biological inheritance of learning itself? A civilization doesn't have to survive physically to continue influencing the future. It can live on in the capacities it nurtured. The people who learned to measure the heavens might have set in motion not just a tradition of astronomy, but an evolution in the human mind, an increased sensitivity to pattern, a predisposition toward curiosity. Those traits would be passed down, selected for, refined. Over millennia, they would become instinct. Curiosity would no longer be a luxury, it would be our nature. The same might be true for empathy and cooperation. In isolation, intelligence means little. The ability to share, to teach, to build together, those are the traits that make civilization possible. The first societies that practiced them would have thrived, and their descendants would carry the biological traces of that success. The hormone oxytocin, the neurotransmitters that regulate trust and bonding, these are ancient chemical tools for connection. They make collaboration feel rewarding. They turn social behavior into survival. The first civilization may have discovered that principle long before we could name it, building cooperation not only into culture but into biology itself. Even fear, often seen as primitive, plays its part in inherited memory. Certain phobias of snakes, spiders, heights, or confinement appear more readily than others, suggesting an ancestral origin. Our brains are prepared to fear what once endangered us, even if we have never encountered it. This readiness might be the residue of ancient lessons, survival encoded into reflex. Somewhere in that reflex lies another form of teaching, a warning passed from generation to generation, without words. Memory doesn't always need to be conscious to protect. When you think about it this way, humanity becomes a kind of living archive. Each person carries not only their own experiences but traces of all who came before. We are collectively the record of every adaptation, every challenge met, every lesson learned. Our bodies remember famine and abundance, danger and safety, struggle and cooperation. When we innovate, we're often reactivating potential that has been waiting quietly for the right moment. The first civilization might not have vanished completely. It might simply have become part of us, its knowledge diluted but not erased, its influence invisible but enduring. There's another dimension to this, the way memory shapes not just individuals but entire cultures. Traditions often preserve behaviours that served biological functions long before their reasons were forgotten. Ritual fasting mirrors the cycles of scarcity our ancestors survived. Festivals of light break the monotony of long nights, lifting collective mood during dark seasons. Even art, which seems uniquely human and unnecessary for survival, may have evolutionary roots. The impulse to create and share beauty strengthens social bonds and reduces anxiety. In that sense, culture is not separate from biology. It's the continuation of evolution by other means, an adaptation that uses meaning instead of mutation. The same pattern appears in how humans seek knowledge. Our drive to explore, to discover, to explain. It's an instinct that resists satisfaction. We've been described as a species of restless learners, always reaching beyond necessity. That restlessness could be another inherited trace, a response shaped by the success of those who learned more than they needed to survive. Curiosity itself may be an ancient survival mechanism. refined by the first societies that valued knowledge as much as food. To wonder is to prepare. To ask questions is to remember that there are always answers left to find. The possibility that memory can live in our genes also changes how we see time. It means the past isn't behind us, it's within us, influencing how we respond, how we think, how we dream. The boundaries between history and biology blur until they become the same process. The accumulation of experience, whether in neurons or nucleotides. Each life is a new edition of an ancient manuscript, slightly revised but carrying the same core chapters. In that sense, every human being is a continuation of the same story that began when the first teacher lit the first fire and shared its warmth. It's remarkable to realise that we may still be acting on instructions written long before language. The way we form communities, the way we teach our young, the way we look for meaning, all of it could be echoes of the same impulse to preserve knowledge through connection. Our ancestors didn't just pass down what they knew, they passed down how to know. That method, observation, memory, cooperation, is the inheritance that has never been lost. It's the quiet bridge between what was taught and what became instinct. Science may someday be able to trace these patterns more precisely, mapping how collective experience shapes evolution. For now, we can only glimpse it through parallels and intuition. But even without full understanding, the idea feels right. It explains why humanity seems to awaken in waves, rediscovering truths as though remembering them. It explains why certain ideas appear simultaneously in different places, why progress feels cyclical rather than linear. Knowledge may not be invented anew each time. It may simply re-emerge when conditions allow, drawn from a reservoir that never fully empties. The memory written not in libraries, but in life itself. If the first civilization taught early humans everything, perhaps what they truly taught was not a list of facts, but a way of thinking durable enough to survive extinction. They planted it in behaviour, in habit, in instinct, in the very shape of the human brain. Their wisdom became biology, and from that biology, culture would bloom again and again, no matter how many times the earth reset itself. Each rebirth of civilization would be less a new beginning, and more a remembering, an awakening of a knowledge already within. When we study genetics today, we often speak in terms of ancestry tests and lineages, of where we came from geographically. But the deeper ancestry is not about location. It's about the continuity of experience. The genes we carry are not just markers of origin. They are messages, traces of how our species learned to adapt, to think, to create meaning. The story of humanity is written in them in a language we're only beginning to decipher. And so, as we look to the future, we might see that our evolution is still ongoing, still shaped by the same forces that began it. The knowledge we create today, the technologies, the systems, the ways of living, will leave marks of their own, perhaps in the bodies and minds of those who come after. They will inherit not just our genes, but our responses, our resilience, our mistakes. Every generation edits the story. Every generation remembers in its own way. When you think of it that way, the distance between the first civilization and us doesn't feel so great. Their memory might still be here, alive in our cells, guiding us through impulses we mistake for intuition. The urge to build, to teach, to look upward and wonder. All of it might be their final message, still unfolding. The genes carry it, quietly, invisibly, like a whisper that has never stopped moving through time. And if that's true, then forgetting becomes impossible. Because even if every book burned, even if every monument crumbled, the memory would remain, written where it cannot be erased, in us, where history and life are one and the same, waiting to be remembered again. Forgetting is an inevitable part of remembering. It isn't an error in the system, but the system itself. The mind lets go so that it can continue. The world changes, and what no longer fits begins to fade. Yet sometimes forgetting isn't natural. Sometimes it happens by necessity, by choice, by survival, or by the slow erosion of meaning over time. The story of why humanity might have forgotten its first teachers is not one of neglect, but of transformation. It's the story of how knowledge can become too large to hold, how it breaks apart, and how each fragment must be rediscovered in new language. We live in a world built upon rediscovery. Every innovation we claim as new feels, on close inspection, like a memory returning in another form. Our ancestors built calendars from shadows. We build atomic clocks from particles. They map the stars with the naked eye. We map galaxies with telescopes. They measured the Earth with rope and horizon. We measure it with satellites. The difference is scale, not spirit. Yet somewhere between the simplicity of observation and the complexity of modernity, we lost something. Not the knowledge itself, but the intimacy of it. The connection between learning and living became abstract. The teachers we once remembered became distant, blurred into myths, forgotten not because they failed, but because their lessons succeeded too well. When knowledge becomes commonplace, it disappears from memory. The first time someone learned to start a fire, it was a miracle. The 1,000th time, it was routine. The same is true of every discovery that shaped our species. Each began as revelation and ended as habit. Once you no longer have to remember how something was learned, you forget who taught it. That's the first reason the memory of the first teachers faded. Success. Their teachings worked so deeply that they became indistinguishable from instinct. Over generations, as humanity spread and diversified, the original lessons fractured. People carried them into different environments, adapted them to new needs, and reshaped them through new languages. Agriculture became many agricultures. Astronomy became astrology, then science. Architecture became religion, then engineering. Each branch specialized, refined, and detached from the whole. In doing so, the unity of knowledge, the sense that it was all part of one great pattern, was lost. The teachers who had embodied that unity could no longer be recognized. Their image split into countless gods, myths, and archetypes, each preserving one aspect of the original memory. It's possible that the teachers themselves expected this. No instruction can survive unchanged through thousands of years. To last, it has to fragment. The same way seeds scatter in the wind, knowledge must disperse to endure. Each fragment finds its own soil, takes root, and grows into something that fits its time. But the price of survival is distortion. Once enough fragments grow separately, the forest forgets it was once a single tree. The memory of unity becomes myth, and the myth becomes untraceable. Civilization also learned the art of rewriting. Each new culture wanted to see itself as the beginning, not the continuation. Kings claimed divine inspiration, not inherited tradition. Scribes and priests wrote origin stories that placed their people at the center of creation. Conquerors erased the names of those who came before. The older a knowledge was, the more it became hidden under newer claims. Every civilization became both student and revisionist, preserving the knowledge it inherited but renaming its source. The first teachers disappeared not in a single moment of forgetting, but in 1,000 small redefinitions, each carried out with good intentions, to make the old fit the new, to make the foreign familiar. Archaeology shows this process in layers of dust. One culture builds upon another, often literally. Temples become foundations for new temples. Sacred sites are repurposed, reinterpreted, sometimes destroyed to make room for new belief. The continuity is there, but hidden under centuries of renovation. You can see it in Egypt, where the pyramids were already ancient when new kingdoms rose around them. You can see it in Mesopotamia, where ziggurats built on older mounds turned into citadels for later empires. Every generation stands upon the stones of the previous one, rarely aware of how deep the foundation goes. Forgetting also happens through translation. When oral stories were finally written, their language shifted. Words lost context. Metaphors turned into literal descriptions. What might have once been scientific or instructional became religious or poetic. A line describing the alignment of stars could become a hymn. a formula could become a prayer. And as literacy spread unevenly, those who could read and write gained control over what was remembered. Knowledge became selective, filtered by what seemed important to preserve. The rest, the methods, the reasons, the subtleties, fell away. Over time, only the surface remained, polished into legend. There's a certain irony in that process. Humanity built monuments to remember, but the monuments themselves outlived the meaning behind them. We look at the great ruins today and see mystery where their builders saw clarity. The structures that were once lessons have become questions. The Great Pyramid, the stone circles, the temples aligned with the stars, all were built to teach, but time has stripped away their explanations. Without context, they appear magical. In that sense, forgetting is what turned the first teachers into gods. Once the science was lost, reverence filled the gap. And yet, perhaps forgetting was necessary. Complete memory can be paralyzing. To move forward, the mind must sometimes release the past. A species that remembers everything cannot adapt. We had to forget in order to innovate, to rediscover. Each cycle of forgetting and learning again created evolution, not just biological, but intellectual. The loss of direct lineage forced creativity. It made us rebuild, reimagine, re-understand. The first teachers might not have wanted to be remembered by name at all. Perhaps their goal was continuity, not credit. To design knowledge that could be reborn wherever it was needed. There's a pattern in human history that supports this. Every few thousand years, civilizations rise to remarkable heights of understanding, only to collapse, scatter, and begin again. Each time, the recovery seems faster, as if the knowledge had been buried, not erased. The Greeks rediscovered geometry that the Egyptians already knew. The scholars of the Islamic Golden Age preserved and expanded the mathematics of Greece. The Renaissance revived both. Modern science built upon all of it. Knowledge doesn't die, it hides. Forgetting is only the surface of preservation. Still, there's a difference between forgetting information and forgetting meaning. We remember how to build, but not always why. We can measure the stars, but we rarely look at them with the same reverence as those who first taught us to watch. We treat knowledge as utility, not continuity. That shift, from participation to observation, from belonging to control, may be the deepest kind of forgetting. The first teachers, whoever they were, didn't just pass down data. They passed down perspective. They saw understanding as a relationship with the world, not a conquest of it. When that relationship broke, the memory of them went with it. Every culture carries a version of that loss, the fall from paradise, the departure of the gods, the breaking of the covenant between heaven and earth. These aren't just religious ideas, they're reflections of disconnection. The paradise we lost wasn't a garden of luxury, it was unity, the sense that learning and living were the same act. The gods didn't abandon humanity. Humanity drifted away from the simplicity that made the divine visible. The more we built, the less we needed to remember where building came from. Language played a role too. As it evolved, it became more precise but less symbolic. Early languages were woven from metaphor. A single word could mean sky, spirit, direction, and knowledge all at once. That ambiguity kept the world alive with meaning. Over time, we demanded clarity. We separated terms, defined borders, categorized experience. In doing so, we gained accuracy but lost resonance. The first teachers might have spoken a language that connected things we now separate: science and spirit, observation and feeling, fact and myth. When that language fractured, so did the memory it carried. There's also the matter of pride. Once humans began to see themselves as masters of nature rather than students of it, the idea of older, wiser teachers became uncomfortable. To admit inheritance felt like weakness. Progress demanded self-sufficiency. Cultures began to describe their knowledge as divinely bestowed or self-derived, not taught by predecessors. The first civilization, if it ever existed, was written out of history not through malice, but through ego. The more we achieved, the more we convinced ourselves that we had done so alone. But forgetting is never complete. Even when names vanish and stories fade, the essence of teaching persists. You can feel it in the unbroken chain of curiosity that runs through every human generation. The same questions return again and again, just phrased differently. What is the universe made of? Where did we come from? How should we live? These are the same questions that must have been asked around the first fires, beneath the first stars. The teachers are gone, but their classroom never closed. The act of questioning is their legacy, the proof that we still carry their lesson even if we've lost their faces. Sometimes, fragments of memory resurface in unexpected ways. An ancient symbol reappears in a new culture, its meaning reinvented but its form identical. A forgotten method of construction is rediscovered by engineers who believe they've invented something new. A mathematical ratio appears in architecture across continents separated by time. These recurrences feel accidental, but perhaps they're not. Perhaps they're the body remembering what the mind forgot. The same way instincts re-emerge in behaviour, or genes reawaken under pressure. Memory doesn't vanish. It hides in potential, waiting for the right moment to return. If the first teachers intended to make their lessons eternal, they couldn't have chosen a better medium than humanity itself. We are the carriers of their work, not through monuments or texts, but through the very capacities they nurtured, the need to learn, to question, to build meaning. Forgetting them by name may have been part of the plan. Immortality through anonymity, knowledge that transcends its source by becoming universal. It's possible that they understood a truth we are still learning, that to be remembered perfectly is to be confined, but to be forgotten partially is to live forever through reinterpretation. Every new civilization that rediscovers their lessons renews them, keeps them relevant, gives them life. The first teachers may be gone, but they are also everywhere, embedded in every act of understanding. Still, when you walk among ruins or look up at the stars, there's a sense of longing that never quite fades, a feeling that something important was once known and has slipped away. It's the same feeling that drives archaeology, philosophy, art, and science alike. The sense that we're searching for something we used to have. Perhaps that's what memory does when it forgets. It turns into desire. The desire to know is memory's way of reminding us that something worth knowing exists. The forgetting of our first teachers might not be a tragedy then, but a rhythm, a pulse that keeps civilization moving forward. Each age must rediscover the foundations in its own way. The lessons must be reinterpreted, adapted, translated into the language of the moment. Total remembrance would freeze growth. Forgetting, paradoxically, is how we learn again. But even as we move forward, small signs of the original memory still linger. The way we instinctively build in patterns that echo nature. The way we align our cities with the sky, even when we no longer need to. The way our rituals repeat the same gestures made thousands of years ago. Lighting fire, offering food, marking time. These are not coincidences. They are muscle memory at the scale of civilization. Proof that somewhere beneath the noise of modern life, the old lessons still move through us, shaping the way we live, even if we can no longer name their source. Perhaps the greatest irony is that we have spent millennia searching for proof of them, digging through ruins, decoding myths, scanning the seabed, when the evidence has been with us all along. We are the evidence. Our thoughts, our curiosity, our patterns of creation, all of them are extensions of that original teaching. The first teachers are forgotten because they succeeded. They embedded themselves so deeply into us that there is no longer a distinction between their knowledge and our nature. And maybe that is how they planned it, to vanish into their work, to let their students become their legacy, to make forgetting the final lesson. Because in forgetting, we are compelled to seek, and in seeking, we keep their wisdom alive. What they began still unfolds, written not in stone or in text, but in the quiet persistence of the human mind, the one place where forgetting always leads back eventually to remembering. Light has always been our oldest teacher. It was the first pattern life ever learned to follow, the first signal that told the world when to wake and when to rest. Long before thought existed, long before sound, light guided the rhythm of everything that would one day open its eyes. Plants learned to turn toward it, animals learned to chase or avoid it, and somewhere in that endless dialogue between light and life, consciousness appeared. A mind that could not only feel the warmth of light, but think about it, name it, measure it, and eventually try to understand where it came from. Even now, the light that reaches us from the stars is older than anything we can imagine. When you look up at the night sky, you're seeing not the present, but the past still arriving. Every glimmer is an ancient moment preserved in motion. The first civilization would have known that feeling well. They didn't need telescopes to recognize that light carried memory. They could see it in firelight, in the sunrise, in the reflection of the moon across water. To them, light wasn't just illumination. It was instruction. It revealed the order of the heavens, the passage of time, the renewal of life. It was the most faithful teacher, patient, impartial, unceasing. Humanity's story has followed light since the beginning. Fire taught us warmth and transformation. The sun taught us season and direction. The stars taught us scale and continuity. Each form of light became a different kind of lesson. The fire burned nearby, fragile but controllable. The sun moved above, distant but dependable. The stars stayed fixed, too far to touch, but close enough to remember. Together they formed the three levels of understanding, the immediate, the cyclical, and the eternal. Every civilization built its knowledge around those layers, learning first to master what was near, then to predict what was recurring, and finally to contemplate what never seemed to change. When we light a fire today, we rarely think about its lineage. Yet the flame in a candle, a stove, or a lamp is the same phenomenon that once gathered people into circles of safety. It was under that flickering glow that stories began, that language found rhythm, that faces became visible to one another in the dark. Firelight turned isolation into community. It created the space where thought could grow. It's not an exaggeration to say that civilization itself was born from the ability to control light, not just to see by it, but to shape it, to use it as a tool and symbol. The same applies to the light of the sun. Our entire calendar, our architecture, our sense of time are built upon its motion. Every shadow it casts is a kind of writing. Every dawn and dusk is a form of punctuation. The people who learned to track it, to align stones to mark solstices, were reading from the same page that we still live upon. When they raised their monuments to frame its path, they weren't worshipping the sun as a god. They were acknowledging it as a teacher. It was the only constant that never failed to return. Its patience became the first definition of faith. The stars, however, offered a different kind of lesson, one that reached beyond survival into something like philosophy. To watch the sky at night was to encounter permanence, to sense that, even though life changed constantly, there was an order that endured. The constellations were reminders that pattern exists even in chaos. They gave humanity the confidence to imagine structure in everything, in music, in mathematics, in thought. You can almost see the transition from stargazing to logic, from wonder to understanding. The same brain that traced Orion's belt began to draw straight lines and angles, began to measure, began to abstract. Light taught geometry. Geometry became architecture. Architecture became civilization. Over time, light became a metaphor for knowledge itself. To understand was to see. To be ignorant was to remain in darkness. The first teachers might have used that very comparison when trying to explain the nature of awareness. Every culture that followed kept the image alive. Enlightenment as illumination, wisdom as brightness, truth as the dawn. It's no coincidence that nearly every creation myth begins with light, emerging from chaos. It's not just about physics, it's about recognition. Awareness is the beginning of order. The moment we notice light, we become capable of seeing everything else. But light can also erase what it reveals. Too much brightness blinds, just as too much certainty dulls curiosity. The first teachers likely understood that too. They might have known that knowledge, like sunlight, requires balance, enough to guide, never enough to consume. That's why they may have hidden their lessons in story rather than in lore. Story allows shadows. It preserves mystery. It leaves room for interpretation. In that sense, myth wasn't a veil over truth. It was protection for it, ensuring that the light didn't burn too hot, that future generations could rediscover it slowly, in their own time. As humanity advanced, it learned to bend light in new ways. We polished mirrors, shaped glass, and eventually created lenses. With them came telescopes, microscopes, cameras, each one another form of memory. The telescope remembers light that left its source before humans existed. The microscope remembers worlds too small for eyes to know. The camera remembers moments long after we've forgotten them. In every case, light is the courier of memory, carrying the image of what has been into the future. It teaches us not just what to see, but how to see. Even artificial light, the one that fills our nights now, carries a hidden lesson. It's the embodiment of control, of human desire to command day and night at will. But it also creates distance from the natural rhythms that once structured our lives. When every hour is lit, the boundary between waking and resting blurs. The stars fade behind the haze. We begin to forget how the dark once taught us to listen. The ancient balance between light and shadow shifts toward permanence, and in that permanence the quiet part of learning is lost. Light was never meant to be constant. It was meant to alternate, to teach through contrast. We learn in brightness, but we reflect in darkness. Perhaps that's why sleep remains one of our most mysterious states. When the body turns away from light, the mind begins to make its own. Dreams that mix memory and imagination. It's another kind of teaching, one that doesn't rely on the senses. The same cycle that governs the planet governs us. Day gives us information. Night turns it into meaning. The alternation between the two has shaped our species for longer than history itself. In that rhythm lies the essence of all understanding. Learn, forget, dream, remember. The first civilization, if it existed, might have built its entire philosophy on that rhythm. Its monuments tracked light not only to measure time, but to embody this principle, that illumination and shadow must coexist. Their cities may have been designed as reflections of celestial movement, every sunrise and sunset marking a lesson in balance. They might have taught that to live wisely is to stay aligned with those cycles, to act when the light is present, to rest when it recedes, to trust that both are necessary. The idea still survives in fragments, in the yin and yang of Chinese thought, in the balance of Mahat in Egypt, in the duality of day and night worshipped by countless cultures. The teachers may be gone, but the pulse of their wisdom remains, moving quietly through everything that still responds to the sun. Science, too, has come full circle. The more we study light, the more it becomes both tool and mystery again. It behaves as wave and particle, as both energy and information. It bends around gravity, carries the history of stars, and defines the limits of what we can observe. Everything visible exists because of it, and yet it itself cannot be seen directly. The paradox mirrors consciousness. We experience it constantly, but can never step outside it to observe it. It's as though the universe built its own lesson into its structure, that awareness and light are two versions of the same thing, each reflecting the other endlessly. This understanding that knowledge and illumination are inseparable might be the final echo of the first civilization's teaching. When they taught humans to observe the world, they weren't just giving practical skills, they were shaping perception. They were showing that to know something is to bring it into light, and that every act of seeing changes both the observer and the observed. It's the same truth physics would rediscover millennia later, when we learned that even light behaves differently when watched. The act of noticing is itself creative. What's remarkable is how naturally this principle still governs our lives. Every discovery we make begins in darkness, in not knowing, in curiosity, in the willingness to search. Then comes the spark of understanding, the small flame that grows with attention. Once the light fills the room, the search ends, but another begins somewhere else. The process never stops. Knowledge expands the way dawn spreads. Quietly, steadily, without clear boundaries. The sky brightens, and we realize that what we thought was the horizon was only the edge of what we could see. You can feel that same pattern within yourself. Every time you learn something, it's as though a light has turned on in the mind. You can sense its warmth, its clarity, but you also know that it fades eventually, not because it was false, but because there's always more to illuminate. The teachers of the past might have understood that forgetting and remembering are part of the same continuum, that the goal isn't to hold the light permanently, but to keep finding it again. Each rediscovery is another sunrise. Each question is another night before it. When humanity first began to use light intentionally, fire for cooking, torches for exploring, lamps for ritual, it wasn't only about survival, it was about continuity. To carry a flame was to carry time. It linked one moment to the next, one person to another. The passing of the torch became more than a metaphor. It was a physical act of memory. Even today we light candles to mark remembrance, to celebrate beginnings, to mourn endings. Fire still carries meaning older than words. It's the gesture that connects us backward and forward simultaneously. If we think of the first teachers as those who taught us to use light, in both the literal and symbolic sense, then we never stopped being their students. Every form of technology that followed is just another refinement of that lesson. Electricity, digital screens, lasers, fibre optics, all are new dialects of the same language. We're still shaping light, still learning from it, still using it to reveal what was hidden. In this way, the continuity from torch to telescope to touchscreen is unbroken. The material changes, but the message doesn't. Light teaches by existing, and we keep finding new ways to listen. It's humbling to realize that the light we see now, the glow of cities, the glare of machines, comes from the same source that guided our ancestors through caves and oceans. The photons themselves are ancient. They follow the same laws, move at the same speed, carry the same energy. The world has changed, but the medium of understanding remains the same. When you hold a small light in your hand, you are holding the same principle that once set humanity in motion. The desire to see, to know, to continue. And perhaps that is what memory really is. A form of light moving through darkness, finding shape as it goes. Every life adds its own brightness to the long chain, each generation reflecting a little more, understanding a little differently. The first civilization may have disappeared, but its light didn't. It diffused, scattered like starlight through the vastness of time. What we call human progress may simply be that light finding new places to shine. When you step outside at night and look upward, the oldest stars still send their messages. Some of them no longer exist, but their light is still on the way, still crossing the silence to reach you. It's a reminder that knowledge, once released, never truly dies. It keeps travelling, touching new minds, forming new meanings. That's what the first teachers must have understood, that their lessons didn't need to be preserved in monuments or names. It was enough to set them in motion. The rest would take care of itself. Somewhere in that endless exchange between brightness and shadow, between knowing and wondering, lies the real inheritance of humanity. We are both the light and the eyes that follow it. Every thought, every story, every question continues the same journey that began when the first spark caught flame in the dark. The torch still burns, passed hand to hand across generations, not always seen, not always understood, but always alive. And so the world turns, half in shadow, half in light, each side teaching the other what it means to exist. The sun will rise again tomorrow, as it always has, carrying the same lessons in its warmth. We'll wake beneath it, carry its light forward in our work, and when it sets, we'll light our own small fires and let them remind us. The lesson continues quietly, patiently, endlessly. The light that still teaches, asking nothing but that we keep watching, keep wondering, and keep remembering what it means to see.